Welcome to the Salutogenic Asset-Focused Narrative Exposure Therapy. What we're going to introduce to you in this training is a safe way to move your client through a narrative process to help them resolve trauma. It is also a really nice technique to use in many other presentations. You can use it for depression or anxiety or a number of other things, but it is designed for the primary use to be with trauma. It is easy to learn. It is easy to kind of practice into a competency level with it. And what we want to do in presenting this to you is to lay a foundation for the science behind it and then give you practical examples of how to put that into work. So the last part of this training, you're going to see a lot of video clips where we then talk about what you saw, what you should be paying attention to, what kind of thinking you needed to have to do that. We'll do a complete breakdown of a session for you. And what we're hoping is at the end that you'll have the basic ability to begin to put this together and use it in your own practice to help people move through the trauma resolution process. So with that said, let me introduce myself a little bit. My name is Dr. Bob Roten. I am the president of the Arizona Trauma Institute, and this is our contact information, both email address and office phone number. If you have questions or you need additional information that we can help you with, please feel free to reach out. I will ask that you be succinct in any email you send me and give me a little bit of time. I get about 100 emails a day, and so sometimes I'm a little slow getting back to them, but I will get back to them. In addition to this training itself, we have a resource page which has many, many additional resources on it, and this is where you can find it. The resource page has trauma assessments. It has research, it has PowerPoints, it has books, PDF versions of books, and it has quite a few videos that we use to support this material. In addition to that, the Arizona Trauma Institute YouTube page has a number of trainings that are available on there at no charge, and and a lot of information to support clinical practice. So please avail yourself of both of these. There's no charge for them. We would ask if you use the YouTube page that you like it, so that we know that it's being of value. On the resource page, you have to sign in and create a user account. You want to hang on to that user account information so you can go back there repeatedly. There isn't any cost or fee for that. We do it as part of our attempt to provide you with enough support to use anything that you get from one of our trainings. And if you go into our website and you look under any of our trainers, you're going to find a resource page that trainer's material can be found in. And we do that again to support you folks that are taking these courses. So what are you going to learn by being in the SafeNet training? You're going to get an introduction to the salutogenic approach to trauma treatment. You're going to have a different way of looking at emotions, thinking, and behavior, and how they are driven by changes in the body's chemistry. We're also going to look at the body's nervous system and how it's built through responses to the environment. We're going to talk about that the nervous system builds neural pathways that are the foundation of all of our beliefs, our procedural memories, essentially our comfort zone, if you will, and that most of our daily activities are ran through an autopilot system of the body and nervous system rather than intentional, deliberate acts. What else you're going to learn is to be able to reduce your reliance on neocortex and amygdala-centric models of treatment. And it'll make more sense as we go through the training. But when you're dealing with people that have trauma histories and their body is in a state of arousal and they're having excessive amounts of cortisol, noradrenaline, adrenaline, anyway, and the other kind of chemicals that shove that system out of balance, people don't have access to their great access to their thinking and executive functioning, and they don't have they have an increased reactivity to high levels of intense emotion. So a lot of the traditional models of treatment tend to either be neocortex-centric, which would be like your cognitive processing, cognitive behavior therapy courses, and or amygdala-centric, which is more of your highly emotion-focused kinds of therapy processes. Both of the models, regardless in those two camps, are excellent, but quite often your trauma client isn't in the state to benefit from either of those. And so we're going to talk about walking the middle line and helping your trauma client navigate through therapy, and you'll understand a lot more about that as we move through this. We're going to talk about the use of language to focus on a person's assets, building capacity and competency. We're going to talk about the use of assumptive language to convey possibility and to underscore that competency. We are also going to introduce the structure of SafeNet to you, and then we're going to do a clinical demonstration using SafeNet. So it's a pretty ambitious, training for us to take on, and I hope it's something that really kind of speaks to you as we go through this. And again, if you have questions, many of you are going to be watching this, later on after the fact, and what we're hoping is if you have questions, you will go ahead and send them in to myself or call our offices, and we'll be glad to assist you in answering those questions. All right, so let's talk about salutogenesis. What is it? And where does it come from? And what a weird word is it? For many years, I have trained therapists and spoken before many, many audiences in the mental health professionals, in children's services, and in a number of other settings, conferences and the such. And what I repeatedly hear from them quite often is, as they hear me talk about how to work with trauma clients, a lot of the people come up and say, I'm already doing some of this, and nobody taught me how to do this. I had to learn it through trial and error. And I so admire professionals that are paying attention and refining what they do. And a lot of times that takes several years of their clinical practice to kind of get to that place where they're doing that. But quite often it is what I'm presenting isn't unknown. It's just not constructed this way, or it's not structured in one umbrella for them. So I am really positive about this as I begin to kind of move into giving you this information, is that a lot of this is going to ring true with you, maybe not from what you were taught in school, but from what you've learned in working with clients. I want to be really clear. What I'm inviting each of you to do is suspend your commitment to the beliefs and practices and the common culture of mental health. And I'm asking you to give yourself just a space to consider and reflect on what we're sharing in this course. And I'm introducing you to perhaps a new term, salutogenic or salutogenesis. So there are two kind of general ways of looking at what we are seeing when we are dealing with mental health in general. But also, if we go to a broader spectrum and say health in general, there's a pathogenic point of view which is very prominent, and it is the primary view of medicine and mental health. A pathogenic perspective has become dominant in all sorts of arenas. It's not just medicine. It's mental health, it's medical services, it's education, it's human rights, even some business models and parenting practices are pathogenic. Well, pathogenic approaches focus on problem resolution, as if the manifest problem is the thing that is wrong. And it assumes quite often, and quite often incorrectly, that there is a single cause. And we love single causes. We love them, love them, love them. And yet the reality is very few people have a single cause for what's going on. For example, I've worked with a number of families over the years, and what a dysregulated parent will often say, and this is not, I'm not criticizing them, but what you often hear is, well, Johnny is just doing that for attention. Well, what they've done is taken a complex set of behaviors and they've reduced it to a single cause. And they try to treat the problem rather than addressing the environment that's creating this. And that's problematic. And it's one of the shortfalls of a pathogenic perspective. However, a pathogenic perspective is how we've built all these systems of services, is we find the problem, we fix the problem, and what we're really doing by being problem focused is we are basically saying, let's get people back to the status quo. The status quo for people that have trauma histories, they weren't healthy and then had trauma and now they're unhealthy. That does occur on an occasion, but most of the time what you're dealing with is a progressive, multiple situations that have overwhelmed the body that are creating the trauma responses. And there isn't a singular cause. And what you're going to, if you're focusing on single causes, you're going to say, well, if they can do this, then everything is great. Let's get this fixed. But it totally doesn't take in the breadth and complexity of what a human being is. The question is really kind of fundamental. Is it true that if the problem is addressed, the status quo is restored? And the next question is really, how many of your trauma clients want to be restored to the status quo? Because the status quo, for somebody that has a whole history of trauma, toxic stress, and adversity, is kind of unpleasant. We don't really want to restore them to that. What we want to do is help them move forward and away from what that experience is into a greater level of health and well-being. So the salutogenic approach was pioneered really by Aaron Antonovsky, who started talking about this in 1968. And the idea is that salutogenesis looks at the factors that are involved in creating wellness. For those of you that have a positive psychology background, the positive psychology movement began in around 1981, 82, is really, whether there's a direct connection to that, these are very similar ideas, is what do you have to do to help create well-being? And that's not the same thing as treating a problem. And in the long term, treating a problem is less effective than how do we design an environment to create long-term well-being. So the key points for salutogenic approaches is health is a continuum. It's not, you're healthy up to this point and then you become unhealthy. It's not a binary where you're healthy or unhealthy. What it is a continuum, and in multiple areas of our life, we are healthier or less healthy based on where we are, what's going on, and it's a very fluid kind of process. The idea that there is a demarcation point that says past this you're sick is kind of irrelevant. It allows people to kind of create simplistic ways to kind of view things, but it's not really very accurate. In a salutogenic point of view, treatment should emphasize helping people create transformation by moving towards health, functionality, and well-being. And the focus is on what we call cumulative gains, or the process of incremental movement towards better health and well-being, supporting the client and helping them be aligned and make sequential progress towards well-being, functionality, and health. Later on, we're going to talk in more depth about this, but we sometimes call this the 1%, the 1% approach to life. And a lot of times we get people in for mental health services, and we want to set these goals that are sometimes very, very admirable, very worthwhile, but the client moving from here to there is going to struggle, because what we focus on in mental health is all the deficits. And in order to really move forward, you have to be able to focus on gains. And so the idea of a 1%, and it's kind of a silly thing, but it really works well with trauma clients, is once you can kind of help them understand what's going on in their own system, they can embrace a 1% solution. If you were to work this week, if you could be 1% improved, could you do that? And of course they can. 1% is nothing, it's easy. If you did another 1% the following week, and if you did that every week for the next year, you'd be 50% better than you are today. Not only that, but because you're building supportive neurostructures to support that change, you're less likely to have relapse. Now, that's kind of I'm kind of being kind of facetious a little bit with that, but the reality is that as people make little gains, the gains tend to become a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger. So instead of having kind of that steady, slow, progressive increase, it tends to have a more arced kind of growth. It begins like this, and then it begins to increase up, and you have quite a better outcome. So again, salutogenic processes support the client's incremental, aligned, and sequential process towards well-being, functionality, and health. Another key concept is that stress is ubiquitous. Nobody that's human gets through this life without experiencing stress. The salutogenesis opens up the possibility for our client to be able to engage in transformation, to use stress management as a rehabilitation factor. In other words, if I can manage my own stress and if I can manage my own physiology, then that's a rehabilitative factor. And when we start talking about how treatment goes, I think it'll make it clearer for you. People have a capacity to actively adapt, and our work is about creating positive futures or transformation, because we have people that already are adapting because of their history of trauma, toxic stress, and adversity. They're already adapting. However, a lot of those adaptations tend to be less than health promoting, less than functionality promoting. And I don't like the term that a lot of folks tend to use in mental health by calling them maladaptive, but if that speaks to you, go ahead and use it. But the reality is it's just adaptive, and some adaptations are health promoting and some aren't. And what we want to do is to help the client create a transformation in their own lives by having as many of those kind of active adaptions that move them forward towards what they'd like to achieve. We embrace the salutogenic operation through focusing on attention to the person's history of movement through their trauma, where a lot of traditional models of treatment for trauma focus on the story itself, the negative narrative, all the painful things that happened. And we're not going to be doing that. We will know the story, but our energy is focused on how did they get up the next day? How did they move through this? How are they redefining the actions that they have taken? How do what they have done reflect competency and capacity rather than symptoms of disease? So when you start looking at a salutogenic asset-focused approach, which is what we're talking about, there are some key features that are built into it. Self-regulation is necessary, so we're going to be talking about that. Capacity building. People need to be able to meet their primary social and emotional needs. They have to be able to be respected and valued for their opinions, their choices, their ideas, and they need to be, respected and not have an agenda put on them. We have to develop a long-term view of positive expectation, which is a process. Everybody can have wonderful goals out here that really are amazing, and everybody wants to get them, but unless you have a long-term view of positive expectation, you're not going to take the daily actions necessary repetitively to move there. And so instead of focusing people on the manifest problem, what we focus on is how do we help them move in that direction, and how do we help them recognize their own strengths and competencies as that happens. We want to strengthen their interpersonal resources, their ability to kind of be resourceful themselves, and we want to strengthen personal resilience factors to stress. So the salutogenic asset approach to dealing with trauma, which we have labeled SafeNet, salutogenic asset-focused narrative exposure therapy, really is built on these concepts. And I think that's pretty much an essential piece of this. In an analysis of Antonovsky's work that was completed in 2011, they basically identified what they considered to be those resources. Remember before we talked about the personal resources? And this is what, particularly in trauma work, what we're looking at is what are those resources? Well, these resources are how, and you think about from the point of view of working with your trauma client, how's the structure in their life? Is it routine? Is it well organized? Is it predictable? Do they have a lot of predictability in their life? Do they have social support? Do they have coping strategies? Is life meaningful to them? Survival is meaningful, but are they living a life that's meaningful to them personally? Are they able to be responsible for their actions? Do they have an adequate confidence in the future, which we call hope? Do they believe that what they're working on is worth investing their time and effort in? Are we focusing them on health and well-being rather than on problem areas and deficits? Are they future-oriented? Are they developing a positive expectancy that they'll be able to have a future without the severity of this problem in it? Are they able to make and sustain emotional connections? And do they have an awareness of their inner and outer world? So we're working to accomplish all of those things as we move through the salutogenic asset-focused narrative exposure therapy process. So as we approach trauma, what we're going to be looking at is change. Change is not done in leaps and bounds. It's increased successively and instrumentally. Clients change their views of themselves through their own recognition and discovery of competency. A lot of times therapists are not patient enough to help the client discover where they're competent. They want to just tell them, boy, I saw that and it was really resilient. Well, the problem with that is it's not very effectual. And a lot of times we are so inundated with the idea that we need to be, validating and reinforcing to folks. But what happens quite often is that we end up reinforcing the painful emotions rather than reinforcing their movement through. And so when you focus on competency and capacity, what you're doing is kind of celebrating the movement through. And it'll make more sense when you actually see this in video demonstrations. Improved incremental self-management that is structured, somatic, and progressive. Increased incremental motivation based on the client's feedback as a tool for strengthening the therapy effectiveness. The therapist's genuine belief that the client can move through the process and actually transform their own lives. And they can support of the client to find their own pacing through the improvement process. I am surprised sometimes when I talk to therapists that are impatient with clients and that want the client to progress faster than they are. And I'm going to say that I usually have that from newer therapists than older, more established ones. And their impatience is really about them not getting their needs met with this client. And while they would never say it that way, that's what you're really seeing. This client isn't progressing the way he should. That's his fault, and he's being, difficult in some way, blah, blah, blah. The reality is that each client is going to improve at a pacing that's unique for them. And they're going to have setbacks, and they're going to have limitations, and they're going to have negative experiences, and they're going to relate a lot of those experiences to past, present, or future possibilities. And other people, as they move through the process, are going to have some effect on that. So we recognize this, and that's why instead of focusing on a single problem, we focus on overall wellness and movement through. Rather than focusing on the bad thing that happened, we focus on how did they move past that. It doesn't mean that it still isn't upsetting to them, but how did they begin to move past that? How trauma is defined is also kind of an important piece. Typically in our culture, when people say trauma, they're identifying it as some kind of big bad event. However, that's really an inadequate explanation, because trauma is more about what the body is experiencing in an environment, whether that's an internal environment or an external environment. It's more about that than an individual event. Trauma is generated by changes in the body and nervous system that, if it occurs early enough in life or lasts or persists long enough, can actually change the way the body functions, can change the way the nervous system works, can change genetic expression, can, in some cases, develop inheritable traits to the next generation. So, it isn't the big bad event. It's the body's being in this overwhelming state of arousal, a stress response essentially, that the body can no longer adapt or can sustain without becoming overwhelmed. The next piece is the human body is designed to be environmentally reactive and adaptive. This is a biological process. It's automatic. It's not a choice. If you lived in northern Canada where it's pretty cold, and you moved here to Phoenix, and particularly if you did that in the summer, you'd be going from, probably 25 to 30 degrees Celsius to 110 to 115 Fahrenheit. That's a huge shift. And your body will adapt to that shift because the body is designed to be environmentally reactive. Now, why is this a challenge for us? Because most of the mental health world sees the problem not as an environmental problem, but as a deficit, that there's something wrong in the head or character of a person, and that if you can fix their head and their character, the problem goes away. That's uninformed and doesn't really match with what the neuroscience and the physiology have uncovered in the last 35, 40 years. What we are looking at in defining trauma now, much the way Dr. Robert Macy defines it, trauma is an overwhelming demand placed on the physiology of the human system. And some of those demands are not intrapersonal, they are environmental. This is a hugely important piece to understand. If you work with children and you're treating them because you see the problem in their head or their character, you're probably going to underserve that child, because children are designed by nature to be environmentally reactive. And you are not going to get this child to outperform the level of stability that is in their environment. So when you're working with children in particular, the first place you look is what's going on in this environment and what is it like for this child to be in this environment. Well, nobody really wants you to do that, because nobody else they want the child to be taking the responsibility. This isn't just in the home where a child is being raised. This is also in the classroom. If we put the onus on the child instead of on the environment, then we can squeeze in 40 kids into a classroom, and if the kid misbehaves, it's because he's a bad kid, rather than this environment is overwhelming this child. And how can we deal with that? Or, in a workspace environment where you have, 10 people in a cubicle farm, and they have no privacy. They're talking all day. There's a lot of stress in that environment. And when one of them behaves inappropriately or says something that's kind of hurtful, there's this big blow up about it. But the reality is the environment is provocative. And since most of us as human beings are going to respond to the environment without any kind of choice in being involved, then you better be paying attention to the environment of the folks you're working with. Well, of course, that has its own headaches, but this is not new. If you go back and look at some of the literature in treating addiction back in the early 70s, we're going back over 50 years, what you're going to find is what? They told people in early treatment to manage your environment. Well, how did they say that? Don't hang out with the people you used to hang out and use with. Don't go to the places where you used to use. Don't drive past those places. Don't eat or drink foods or beverages that are associated with using. Essentially, manage your environment if you want to stay sober. But somehow, the mental health world, when they're dealing with somebody that has a problem that's annoying somebody, then they want to focus on the problem rather than the environment. And what salutogenic processes look at is kind of that balance between individual characteristics and environmental influences. So again, trauma is an overwhelming demand placed upon the physiological human system. So we're going to start with hormones and neurochemicals. Again, what we want people to know is enough about the physiology to understand what's happening when they're having a traumatic experience overwhelming their body, which is congruent with the definition we just gave you from Robert Macy. So as we move forward, what I'm going to suggest to you is, if you don't have a good basic understanding of human anatomy and the neurophysiology of a person, you probably are going to underserve your trauma client, because I think the simple truth is that everybody recognizes that our nervous system is running the show. Our nervous system is the foundation of all of our thoughts and sensations and emotions. In other words, we can, in the tradition of mental health, what happened is that as dualism emerged into the philosophy of psychology, we ended up separating the body from emotions, thinking, and behavior, and those became the pinnacle of observation in the psychology world, and the body was kind of left in the realm of medicine. And the unfortunate piece of that is that you don't have emotions, thinking, and behavior without this body. And a lot of what this body perceives of the world are experienced through sensations. So I feel unhappy, I'm having a sensation in my body. So we can't really separate the two. You have to be able to know both of those arenas in order to really serve your trauma client well. Next, our nervous system strives to make everything work in concert, a unity, if you will. I like the term concert. If you think about this, what trauma really is doing is breaking the unity. Imagine sitting in a huge theater for an orchestra presentation, and it's I don't know. We have the Phoenix Symphony here. Think of where you live. What is a body that is a well-recognized orchestra of some kind, or a well organized musical organization. And when they play music, it should all be kind of integrated in unit and have a great unity to it, because that synergistic effect of having unity makes it this beautiful melody, this beautiful piece of music. But if a section is out of sync with the rest, then throws the sound off for everything. I mean, your string section can be working just wonderfully, and it's right in tune, and your woodwinds are right in tune. But if your percussion folks are off, even a half measure somewhere, it's going to sound awful. And a lot of times that's what is happening in the nervous systems of our trauma client. Because of the trauma, they have difficulty creating this, if you want to think of it, a unified brain and nervous system concert. And so part of what we're looking at is how do we help increase the efficiency of and create greater unity in that process. Intellectually, we are looking at our nervous system responses and reactions to giving meaning to much of the world and our environment, because it's our reactions to things. You can have two people experience the same thing, and one thinks it's a hoot and a whole bunch of fun. Another one is terrified out of their skin. Well, the difference isn't the nature of the activity. It's the nature of the person's interpretation. And what are they basing that on is their own history of learning and experience. And that is a body sensation, sensory input that is influencing the meaning that we make. So if you're not aware of how the physiology works that way, you're likely to underserve your trauma client. Most of the nervous system activity is occurring at a non-conscious, what we call a neuroceptive level. In other words, most of our activity is not conscious. Let me give you a silly example of this. If you will do this with me, maybe it'll make sense. Put your hand up and wiggle your fingers. Now, you did that on purpose. You moved your hand up and you wiggled your fingers. But you're not thinking about the bulk of the activity here. Were you aware of the hormones that changed in your system to trigger the muscles to react the way they needed to react, to put your hand up, to move your fingers? Did you sense the movement of the tendons and muscles? Did you recognize the change in blood flow to that area? There's a whole bunch of things that are going on at a non-conscious level. Yes, you chose to lift your hand and wiggle your fingers, but the mechanism of you doing that is just non-conscious. And we have a lot of what we do every day is really neuroceptive, non-conscious activity. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that through this training, and hopefully that will make more sense to you as we go through it. The starting point for understanding trauma is that changes in biochemistry and hormone levels are changing emotions, thinking, and behavior. In other words, the natural responses of the body to stress out there or stress generated from in here is to change your emotions, your thinking, and your behavior. It's not right, it's not wrong, it's not good, it's not bad, it's just chemistry. And what what we know about this stuff is we actually have a pretty good understanding of what's predictable with what changes may be occurring. And that's, but wow, when I first started discovering that, a number of years ago, that there were predictable responses you should see if someone's having this kind of a body experience. It recalibrated my understanding of bad behavior or problematic behavior. Because if somebody's having a change in biochemistry, there is, of course, a corresponding changes in thinking, emoting, and behaving. We need to understand physiology to work with traumatized people most effectively, and changes are not pathology. They are predictable, biologically correct responses. Now, a lot of times I say that and people say, well, I don't like this and I don't like that and they shouldn't be doing such and such. And that's fine, but that's not, just because you don't like it or somebody finds it annoying or somebody finds it disruptive or somebody finds it difficult does not make it a biologically wrong response. In fact, a lot of times what they are experiencing are completely predictable biological responses that are biologically correct. Are they socially unfortunate? Quite often, but they're not biologically wrong. And if we could understand this, we'd see a tremendous shift away from judgment, criticism, and labeling of people, because you're often not dealing with a true mental health issue. You're dealing with a body that is overwhelmed, and a lot of that is going to be based on what's going on in their environment, both externally and internally. To work with trauma, you need to know how to address these changes in the body that are creating the changes in emotion, thinking, and behavior. You need to be able to help them have enough awareness of their own body to be able to manage the arousal in that body before you really do much of anything else. So again, how do we define trauma for this course? Trauma is an overwhelming demand placed upon the physiological human system. So hormones and neurochemicals, that's our starting point. So let's start. There are a good number of hormones and biochemicals that are affecting us. I've picked I'm going to talk about 7 for this course. 4 are absolutely necessary for us to live any kind of optimal living and have well-being. And those are dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins. Dopamine helps us with a number of things: motivation, pleasure, building patterns, consolidating patterns, having desirable movement towards things, desirable goals towards moving away from things. These are really driven a lot by the dopamine cycles. Oxytocin, incredibly important for attachment and trust, feeling connected to other people. It promotes stable relationships, sometimes referred to as the cuddle hormone or the love hormone. Serotonin, this is necessary for feeling self-worth, feeling like you're a part of a group, that you belong, that you have a positive self-image, which enables you to enjoy being around other people. You have endorphins, which are the body's natural way of reducing inflammation and reducing pain. It calms anxiety, it increases cooperation and more empathic relational connections. It's necessary for reducing loneliness and isolation. So if we have fairly good levels of this, we're going to have an improved immune functioning. We're going to be more optimistic. We're going to feel better about, kind of that upbeat kind of place. And if we are not kind of in that nice established range of that for some reason, we're going to experience symptoms. That isn't a right, wrong, good, bad, up, down. It's not a binary situation. It is just a biological reality. Now, we address this sometimes through medication, but a lot of this can be addressed through being able to learn body awareness and to manage the body. So even if we were going to be encouraging people to do medication, we're going to encourage them also to learn how to manage their own body enough to keep these in relative balance. Now, what happens with stress? Which we will cover in just a minute, but I want to talk about what, as these things move from a balance into deficits, you're going to see some really interesting behaviors emerge. So if you have a deficit or a reduction in dopamine, you're going to feel procrastination, you're going to feel low self-esteem, lack of motivation, you're going to feel this low energy or fatigue, you're going to have this inability to focus, particularly with that laser focus that allows you to kind of learn and remember things more easily. You're going to have feelings of anxiousness and hopelessness, and you're going to have a lot of mood swings. And, depending on the degree of reduced dopamine, will kind of have a severe effect on how big those swings are. And so those are tied to reduction in dopamine. Then you have, if we go to oxytocin, what happens when it's reduced? People will feel anxious, they will have trouble sleeping, they're going to feel alienated. What do I mean by that? They can be in a room full of people and feel absolutely alone. Lack of motivation, they may be stressed, they may feel lonely a lot, they're going to have trouble kind of connecting and keeping relationships going, not going to attach well, so that's kind of problematic. But remember, they're not bad behaviors, they are predictable responses to having your oxytocin levels suppressed or low. I really want to make that point before I move on. The first, those procrastination, which so many people get judgy about and critical of, you may be procrastinating because it's not interesting to you. You may be procrastinating because you're wanting to avoid, or you may be procrastinating because you have a reduction in dopamine. There isn't an absolute for every person in every situation. When you have a reduction in serotonin, you're going to have also an influence on insomnia. You're going to have more obsessive compulsive behaviors. You're going to have a lower self-esteem. You're going to have anxiety and panic attacks. You're also going to really be emotionally reactive, where the little things happen and you're having these over-the-top reactions to it because it's very difficult for you to manage your own emotions. Very sensitive. Anxiety and panic attacks are very common. When you have reduced endorphins, you feel anxious, you feel depressed, you feel more aches and pains in your body. Sometimes we call those mystery aches. You don't know why you're having them, but you just feel, or you feel listless. Or you have more problems with headaches and stiffness, and your muscles don't recover as fast as they should if you're in some activity. A lot of mood swing influence here, impulsive behaviors, and a lot of secondary. This sets the stage for a lot of secondary inflammation diseases, having reduced endorphins in your system. Now, those are the four that we started with. I want to talk about the three stress hormones and how they affect these four items. Again, the four items are dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins. And as the stress hormones become more in volume in your system, it's going to have an impact on these four. And the primary impact is a reduction of them, to push them down. So let's look at this and walk through it a little bit. These are the biologically correct, predictable increases in biochemicals. These are the responses you should see. So if I have a large increase in noradrenaline, and large is what we call idiosyncratic, I'll talk about that in a minute. A large increase in noradrenaline, I'm going to feel angry and agitated and aggressive. I'm going to be hostile. I'm going to be incredibly assertive to the point of maybe even being controlling or over controlling. I may be uh, really having a difficult time from learning from my emotional experiences. I'm not going to have much empathy because my system is basically telling me I need to act in a way to control essentially risk or threat as I perceive it, as me as a person perceive it. So what's really happening there? What's the difference between being too much or too, what is a large increase? And a large increase is going to be very unique to the individual. So in global terms, though, I can present it to you pretty easily. So if I was raised in an environment that was relatively stable, relatively optimal, and I had good secure attachments, and I live in that kind of environment now, and I get a big jump of noradrenaline, it's going to take a lot of that to dysregulate me because my system is going to handle that pretty quickly to bring me down into being regulated again. Quickly being, we'll talk about that more in a minute, but if I have a history of growing up in a less than optimal environment, a lot of stress and anxiety and a lot of toxicity in my environments, and I am still living in that kind of environment, the body's going to be slow at this. It takes less. So over here, if I was thinking about in an optimal living life experience, I might, and this you wouldn't, this is a metaphor, not a real measure, I might need an entire cup of this stuff to blow me up. But over here, where I have a less optimal history, and I'm currently living in less optimal environments, I may have the same reaction that this person has with a cup of this stuff, and I only need a quarter teaspoon. The difference isn't the amount in your system. It's your body's sensitivity to it based on your body's sensory, somatic learning system. And so a lot for the person that is really fairly well balanced in their system and they get a big dose, they can blow up and be angry. But this person doesn't need, for them, a large increase is a 50th or 60th of what this person had. They're going to see the same behavior, but this person's going to see that little quarter teaspoon as like, well, that's no big deal. Why are they reacting the way they are? And we move into judgment and criticism because this wouldn't overwhelm our system. However, for their system, it overwhelms them. And so this is incredibly idiosyncratic. It's very unique to each individual. And we have to understand that it isn't wrong behavior. Somebody becomes hostile and controlling, there are certainly social consequences of it that can impact relationships. However, it's not biologically wrong behavior. It is tied to survival. And yes, you may say, well, being asked to participate in reading something in a classroom for a 5-year-old, for a 5th grader, may not seem like a life-threatening experience, but if it overwhelms their system to be asked that, and they deal with it by becoming hostile and aggressive, the teacher is going to see it as bad behavior. The parent may see it as bad behavior, but in reality, what you're dealing with is a child that's system has been compromised. And what we have to do in the world of helping, whether that's in mental health, medicine, education, wherever, in all human services really, is we have to be able to distinguish the difference between what is a normal biological reaction that we should be seeing if this person is experiencing this, and separate that from what is annoying or disruptive, because we often think of the annoying and disruptive thing as being the problem, when the real problem is the level of overwhelm in the person's body. So adrenaline, we've talked about noradrenaline, adrenaline. If you have a large increase in adrenaline, you're going to have fear and anxiety. You're not going to sleep very well. You're going to have difficulty focusing attention. You're going to tend to be hyperactive or fidgety or hypoactive if you're moving, in some instances. You're going to want to withdraw. You're going to want to shut down. You're going to want to run away. Those are all completely correct behaviors when you have a large increase in noradrenaline. Now, most people are familiar with those two and this one. Now, there's a lot more hormones and biochemicals involved, but I'm giving you, we're going to only stay with the 7 that I've talked about today. The problem with cortisol, and sometimes we call this cortisol toxicity, when they've been in a level of arousal for over long periods of time, the nervous system is totally thrown out of balance. But why is it thrown out of balance? Is because as the cortisol level increases, dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins are all reduced. In other words, as this goes up, those get suppressed. As this goes up, those get pushed down. And what does that do for us is it makes it difficult for us to do reality checking. It makes it difficult for us to access our executive functioning. It interferes with our being able to inhibit behavior. It reduces our logic and reason, self-reflection, self-evaluation, and it interrupts our ability to form sequential memory. Those are pretty significant problems because you have a large increase in noradrenaline, a large increase in cortisol. So one of the things we want to make sure you understand is that these behaviors that people find annoying often are absolutely the correct biologically driven behavior. Are they pleasant? No. Are they difficult? Yes. Are they challenging to deal with? You bet. But because it's difficult and challenging does not make the behavior bad behavior. It doesn't make it sinful. It doesn't make the person a bad person. What it does is, more than anything else, reflect that the person making that observation has no tolerance for the neurodiversity of other people, because they're not asking to behave this way. Their body's behaving this way because of a chemical shift. And it would be no different. What we're doing a lot of times in the mental health world is assigning diagnoses because someone is annoyed by this, by the behavior that they're thinking or emoting that they're seeing. But these are biologically correct responses. So I'm going to use a gross one. If you happen to really love broccoli and you have an evening where you're just munching on broccoli all evening long, the next day, you may create some discomfort for other people. You may be disruptive. You may offend people. Is it intentional behavior? Well, you could say yes, because you ate broccoli. And broccoli, when it breaks down in the human system, produces one of the higher levels of methane, which means you are going to pass gas. You eat a lot of broccoli, you will pass gas. It doesn't. So does passing gas make you a bad person? Are you making mistakes? Is it something you're doing that is wrong? No, absolutely. Your body is behaving as designed, and it's correct behavior to pass gas after consuming particularly a large amount of broccoli. Well, essentially in the mental health world, we have people having biological reactions to what's going on in their environment. And people don't want to focus on how to change the environment. They want that person to stop doing what they're doing. And what that's more reflective of than anything else is that the authority figures in the environment are not managing themselves well, because they're reacting to somebody's normal, biologically predictable responses as if it's a chosen behavior, as if it is something they've planned out, as if they have thought about this and this is their choice. A number of years ago, I had a father of a 3-year-old tell me that my son does this just to piss me off. And I looked at him and I smiled and I said, so you're telling me that much like Pinky and the Brain, which was a popular cartoon at the time, much like Pinky and the Brain, you think your 3-year-old child's getting up in the night and planning how to make your life miserable? And he spends some time every night kind of doing that so that he's all armed for an intentional assault on his dad? And he looked at me and says, no, that's stupid. But the way you are talking about it assumes that he's actually doing this on purpose. That's no different than my example. And he goes, well, that's not what I mean. I said, so what you really mean is I can't tolerate my child, and it makes me angry when they don't behave the way I want them to. Is that the child's problem or yours? And he kind of said, I hate talking to you. But the reality is that we're dealing with that all the time, whether it's the parent or a teacher or a mental health worker. We often take completely predictable biological responses, we slap a label on it and say, and essentially destroy somebody's self-worth and self-esteem because we're saying, you're a bad person. You're choosing this behavior, and you can choose not to do this behavior. Well, that's not correct. And if you're doing work with trauma, people that have trauma histories, you have to think differently to maximize your ability to help them. So psychiatry has recognized that symptoms emerge from deficits or excesses in neurochemicals. In fact, the whole pharmacy industry is based on that idea. What we're simply saying is, yes, that is correct. Symptoms do emerge out of deficits or excesses in neurochemicals. And we can take a medication to kind of level that out. But what we're going to suggest instead of that is that you learn how to be aware and manage your own system so you don't become dependent on medication. Again, nothing wrong with medication. It's necessary sometimes. But what I am cautious about is the overuse and overprescribing of medication in situations where people can manage to learn how to manage themselves better so that they don't need those medications. And quite often, particularly when you're dealing with children, what you find is the environment doesn't change enough to support the changes they want in the child. So the child gets diagnosis after diagnosis, medication after medication, and we're essentially poisoning this child's nervous system and physiology with these very strong chemicals. And for the most part, most of those chemicals were never meant for children because we don't want to take the effort to regulate the environment differently. And that's really unfortunate, but that's kind of the reality of what we're dealing with. You have trauma clients, there's not really a lot of good medical protocols for dealing with that. And they're going to have to develop an awareness and some intentionality and be able to act on that intentionality to achieve growth. You cannot do that in a system flooded with these stress hormones. So I hope that kind of gives you a good starting point. Are changes in hormones and neurochemicals affecting you and every other human being? They absolutely are. All around the world. It's not just here. It's not just in Australia. It's not just in Africa. It's not just in China. But the entire world, the human physiology works about the same. Yes, there's different cultures and ethnicities and religions and social practices and politics. But the thing that we are very similar in is we operate in a relatively similar organic body that operates on very, very predictable ways. And if you aren't attuned to that, you're likely to take a behavior out of context and give it a negative label. All over the world, human beings are responding to changes in their hormones and neurochemicals. We all do it. It's one of the if you want to think of it as a universal truth, we are all universally designed to do this. Does that mean it's that the behavior we engage in when we are in that state of arousal is right? No. It's not socially appropriate. It may not be legal. It may be destructive to relationships, but it's not wrong in the sense that it was not planned and it's not volitional behavior. It is automated responses based on how the physiology is being experienced and the learning history that's associated to that. So what happens in the body creates a limbic shift or moves into what we call sympathetic system dominance. We all are kind of familiar with this. The diaphragm clenches up, your muscles constrict, your heart rate changes, your breath rate changes, your blood flow changes, your breath volume, how much air you're taking in changes. The physical sensations tend to be amplified. You tend to have an increased production of insulin. You can have cold hands, cold feet. You can have headaches. You can have other things that happen. But this system, this sympathetic system, is kicked in, and there's correct behaviors when that happens. They're neither right or wrong. They're just predictable responses. But not knowing them is problematic for you if you're going to be working with trauma. So let me give you several that you're probably familiar with, or give me a couple that you're familiar with, but and some others that people generally aren't familiar with. So how many of you remember being a 7th grader, middle school, and having to stand in front of a room and give a talk about something you'd done a report on? How many of you noticed that your breathing was different, your voice was crackling, and sometimes it was doing this through the whole kind of talk? Why? Because you were nervous and your body was pumped full of these chemicals and it changed the way your physiology worked. What is it when your voice is cracking? What's happening? As the muscle structure increases tension, the musculature around the esophageal pathway constricts, which doesn't let air move across it the same way it normally does. And so your voice seems crackly or broken or too high. And when your body relaxes again, your voice goes back to normal. Well, these aren't bad behavior. Nobody is standing up in front of that classroom and wanting to have that happen. In fact, a lot of times when it does begin to happen, it triggers an additional release of chemicals because now they're afraid and they're overwhelmed and there's all sorts of stuff going on in there. But it's essentially a predictable physiological response. And so but there's a lot of judgment. When somebody can't do that, there's judgment by the people that can do it. There's often judgment by authority figures. But the reality is that we overwhelm their system. And I hear this from folks sometimes. Well, they are old enough to be able to not do that. And when I hear that, what it tells me is that the person saying that lacks a significant amount of empathy and has no patience for the neurodiversity of the person that's experiencing that, because everybody's neural patterns are built through their experience from their body. So as we move into this, the excitatory system activates sympathetic dominance, but it can be for excitement and fun, or it can be for threat, danger, or being overwhelmed by something. Both avenues activate that system. It doesn't matter if you're doing it for excitement or for threat recognition. It's going to generate the same correct behavior. And what we've trained people to do in the mental health world is see that correct behavior as a problem. But let's just look at it real quick. So as you experience a limbic shift, it changes you. It changes your emotions, your thinking, and your behavior. And it changes it in very predictable ways. So what you should notice is the moment you move into the sympathetic arousal, you want everything right now. No delayed gratification. No future orientation. You're going to be impulsive, irrational, illogical. You're not going to be doing self-reflection or self-evaluation, and you're going to have a difficult time evaluating rewards because reward evaluation requires you to be present enough to look at something and evaluate that it's worth working towards. Well, if you're in that sympathetic dominant state, that's difficult for you to do. So let's give you some fun little examples of this. If you're behind the wheel of a go-kart, and having a good time, you're in a sympathetic dominant state. You're in that state for having fun. But think about this in this aspect. Imagine somebody pulls up next to you and they're in a go-kart just like you, and they pull up next to you and they say, hey, have you thought about tax shelters and retirement planning? And I'd like to talk to you about it. If you look at them at all, you're going to think, what are they talking about? Because you are not in the right frame of mind to have that. Even if you are interested in that moment, you're not going to be able to have that dialogue. Or if you think about it in a different way, you have a favorite soccer team, and you're watching them play, and all of a sudden the goalie moves into self-reflection and self-evaluation. I wonder if this is my highest and best use. Is this what I want to do with my life? Am I a good person? No, you don't want them to do that. You want them to stay focused on the game in this moment in time. You want them to be fully aroused, fully engaged, fully focused on this, and see the other people on the other team as threats, and you want them to respond to threats right now. So a lot of our entertainments thrive on sympathetic system activity, the sympathetic system being dominant. However, when it is dominant, we're not going to be in a more logical mind. The other thing when people are in sympathetic dominant states is they engage in behavior that is not wise. Here's an example of some folks, filming themselves jumping off the house. They'd done it a number of times. This time the girl missed the pool and she ended up in a wheelchair with broken feet. And then, as soon as somebody was hurt, everybody realized, well, maybe that wasn't so smart. But in your own life history, how many times have you been caught up in the moment? You're in that aroused state, you're having a good time, and you don't even think about if this is dangerous or what the consequences are. Now, somebody outside of you sees you do it, and they go, let me get the face on. Well, they should know that's bad for them. Or, can't they see how bad that is? The reality is they can't. They can't. Because in order to see how bad it's going to be, you have to be able to be self-reflective and self-evaluating. And right now, that part of their brain and nervous system is not accessible because of what's being flooded into their system is actually suppressing those things. Now, how many of you have had a disagreement with a loved one? I don't care, wife, husband, good friend, family member, coworker, somebody you have a relationship with, you get into a conflict with. Now, do you stop and think it through completely? Balance all the arguments? What part am I playing? What part are they playing? Is this fair to both parties? How is this going to affect my relationship a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road? Is any of that going on? No. What's usually happening is you're vying for control, and what you want is acquiescence and compliance. You want your own way, and you want it right now. So does that make you a bad person? No. Are you engaging in bad behavior? No. What you're engaging in is socially destructive behavior, but it is not good or bad. It is just biologically predictable behavior. And it's important to be able to distinguish the difference. So remember, these are correct behaviors biologically. Being in a sympathetic dominant state is not a choice, but a reaction to changes in hormones and neurochemicals. It's not good or bad, right or wrong, up or down, it just is. If I have a change in these chemicals, I'm going to behave in certain ways because this body is designed to do that. And if I don't have strategies to be aware of my body and to manage my own body, then I am essentially enslaved to those hormones and neurochemical processes. So here's a reflective question. How often have you been taught in your mental health world, or if you're an educator in your education world, that the above were a problem and that people are deciding to do these things, or that they're evidence of some kind of deficit pathology, or that there's a problem going on? If they want immediate gratification and they have no future orientation, how many of you are taught to see that as a problem? And how often are you focusing on that rather than getting them in a relaxed, regulated body? How many of you have seen impulsive behavior? You think of impulsive behavior is a choice that they're making. When you have impulsive behavior, you're probably not making an active choice. You're just having a reaction. Irrational, illogical thinking or acting is a choice that we wanted to behave or think this way. That is also not true. That people are always self-aware. That's a grand lie. They're just not. Most of the time, they're not aware. If you don't think the implications, if you're not thinking about what the implications or outcomes would be, that's because there's something wrong with your thinking. That's not true either. We've all done stuff like that. Let's be honest. I learned a really important lesson, but not till after I did this stupid thing. I was with friends. We were riding down a canal bank in June here in Arizona, in the Phoenix area, when I was 14. And we were on horseback. And it was hot. And the canal was full. And we came up to the gates where they were moving the water from one area to another. And they had the gates open. And the water was just shooting out, probably 18, 20 feet into the air onto the other side. And we looked at that and said, ooh, that would be fun. Kicked off our boots, jumped in and dove through. And nobody thought to check how far the gate was open or if it was thought about it being safe, because we were caught up in the moment of it. And that's, again, we were not being in a rational system. We were in that sympathetic dominant state. Now, we learned our lesson because while the gate was open wide enough for us to get through, it was not open wide enough for us to get through comfortably. And every one of us got beat up pretty good, got clothes torn, big scrapes. And after the fact, we said, wow, that was a stupid idea. But at the moment before that, it was great fun. We've all done stuff like that. That isn't a lack of thinking, because you're not in a state to think at that moment. It is a consequence of being in sympathetic dominance. It isn't a choice of behavior. And we need to really help people see the distinction in those things. So if we're going to create lasting change for anybody, and I'm going to use this as a metaphor, we have to have Bruce Banner, not the Hulk. You can't do therapy with the Hulk. I don't care how talented of a therapist you are, you cannot do therapy with a Hulk. You need to have Bruce Banner, because you need to have somebody be able to be self-aware, to be intentional, and to act on that intentionality. That's how transformation happens, whether you're coaching somebody for mastery in an instrument, a sport, or you're working with your client and helping them transform their lives into something different. You only can do that with the Bruce Banner portion, not the Hulk portion. And so I use this as a metaphor that when we move into sympathetic system arousal, we're in Hulk mode. And people aren't going to be thinking, they aren't going to be evaluative, they're not going to be self-reflective, they're going to be engaging in reactive survival type behaviors or fun rather than in being intentional and thoughtful. That doesn't mean they're good or bad or right or wrong or sinful people or not. It just is biology at work. If this is a metaphor that's easier for you, I also use the Einstein and Frankenstein. Maybe instead of Bruce Banner and the Hulk, it's easier to think of a genius like Einstein compared to Frankenstein. Or maybe for little kids, I use this one, that the difference between being a unicorn and a dragon. You have to be able to help people understand that you get the behaviors that are correct. If the dragon system is on, you're going to get correct dragon responses. If you don't want dragon responses, you have to do something to help the environment, the internal and external environment, support somebody being in the unicorn part of their system. So these are kind of metaphors that I use to kind of describe this. Another metaphor that we can use was pioneered by Steve Porges and Deb Dana, which I think is a really excellent tool. We call it the ladder of dysregulation. And essentially, at the top of the ladder, we have full access to our ventral vagal system. We're able to seek attachment. We feel safe. We want to have social connections. We can have reason and logic, and we can plan and follow through on that planning. We can be assertive without being rude. We are self-reflective. We're genuine. We're looking at connecting with other people on a genuine level. We have an improved immune function, and we're more resilient to stress. That's being at the top of the ladder. Being in the middle of the ladder, we're in our sympathetic nervous system, that overwhelming sense of survival, either acting in some way, either by fighting or aggressing or running away. It is an action-oriented system. And what you see in people that are in sympathetic system dominance at the moment, you're going to see them be aggressive and angry and controlling. You're going to see them be sarcastic and use threats and name calling. They're going to intimidate to get control of a situation. They may also run away and flee. That's middle of the ladder behaviors. Bottom of the ladder behaviors, this is where you have your hypoactivities. This is where the dorsal vagal system is in conservation mode, shutdown mode. It's a passive defense system. It's like your body's being anesthetized or put to sleep. And some of the things we see that is feeling numbed out, shut down. You don't want to be seen. You don't want to be noticed. You feel small. You feel emotionally distanced from people. You want to avoid notice as much as possible. You tend to withhold thoughts and feelings that you are having and ideas. That's the bottom of the ladder. Every one of us are moving up and down the ladder all day long. What we often find is people that have trauma histories spend the bulk of their day in the middle or lower parts of the ladder. The middle or lower parts of the ladder are the most consistent areas for the person that is that has a trauma history. So why do we need to be at the top of the ladder, or why do we need to be in Bruce Banner brain, or why do we need Einstein brain in order to transform or move forward? Is because it is only in that system where we have self-regulation, self-compassion, self-awareness, our moral decision-making process and our integrity are tied to that system, self-control, planning, reality checking, inhibiting our own behaviors, stopping ourselves, to grow intentionally, to be resilient, and to problem solve well. We need Bruce Banner. You can't do any of those things in Hulk mode, or Frankenstein mode, or in Dragon mode. You must be in the top of the ladder in order to do these things. There isn't a single model of treatment that I'm aware of that doesn't require people to be at the top of the ladder. They may not say that when they're talking about it, but the function of these models assumes people are at the top of the ladder. Certainly the cognitive behavior approaches do. They assume people are at the top of the ladder and that they are capable of doing all these things. The reality is that many times they are not at the top of the ladder, and then when they fail, then what we end up doing is having the person blamed for their own failure. That is problematic. So I hope that makes sense. So our number one goal, let me say it one more time, our number one goal whenever we're working with a client is to get the client to the top of the ladder and help them develop the skills to stay at the top of the ladder. Because if they can do that, they can benefit from any model of treatment. And if the greater their skill at staying at the top of the ladder, the more intentional and deliberate they are, the better quality of life they have, the more likely they are to create an optimal health for themselves. So what would be next for us then? Know what you are looking at. Does that make sense? You have to know the physiology and what's normal. If you don't know that, you're going to see a lot of these things as being pathology, symptoms. These are symptoms or signs, if you want, that they are broken. They've got a hole in their head or a deficit of character, and that's what's wrong. Folks, that's rarely what's wrong. Yes, there are folks that have deficits of character, and there are people that have deficits in their organic brain and nervous system. But the most of what we deal with is not those folks. So the body has a balanced system. This balanced system regulates the body processes. It works automatically. It's autonomous. It doesn't even require any conscious effort. It's just rolling along, operating as the person as we live our daily lives. When the balance system is thrown out for some reason, the body handles that either by adapting or mitigating. Now, a lot of people would call it different things, but I like to call it adaptation and mitigation. Number one, that's kind of how I've grown to think about it. But number two is I think it's more useful. I don't like the term maladaptive or the good, bad ideas. So it's adaptive or mitigative behavior. And behavioral symptoms result from the overuse of either of these strategies, either overuse of adaptiveness or overuse of mitigation. So when the threat stress response system kicks the body into being out of balance, then you're going to get one or both of these kinds of responses. So let me kind of go through adaptive processes. The adaptive processes are pretty much automatic, and a lot of them are kind of organically built into us. So on the simplest level, it's just what happens to the body when we experience a wound. A paper cut, for example. The body goes through a natural process of healing that is an adaptation. It's adapting to the wound, and it's dealing with that situation. So what happens? You bleed. An hour or so later, it's more tender than it was when you first did it. It may be a little swollen. 3 or 4 days, you can see where the cut was, but it doesn't hurt anymore. And then finally, you may not even see where the cut is anymore. So that's the natural process. It'd be the same as you whack your shin on an end table at night. The next day, you have a nice bruise, and it turns color after a bit, and it fades to where you can't even see where it was at a future point. So that's just the body's natural ability to adapt to wounds and insults is wired into us at an organic level. Now, we also experience wounds and insults to nervous system that are emotional and psychological as well as sensory or somatic. And the body will try to go through that same process. This is in medicine, this process is very clear. We go through the homeostasis process, which is we bleed, the inflammatory phase, which is the wound is creating localized swelling. Indigenous inflammation chemicals go to that area and it gets inflamed, and that's to speed healing really and to prevent infection in that area. And then at the same time that's happening, the body is flooding the area with the building blocks of new tissue that need to be to repair it. And finally, the maturation phase, when it's what we call it's remodeled or it's been completely completely healed of that. So this process, the body goes through automatically. And it's very similar when there's an emotional or psychological or a sensory insult to the body. It's going to go through a stage process of recovery. But and it's going to look a little bit different than this, but it's still a process. It's an adaptive process. And so this is kind of our metaphor for what's going on. So what's happening? Physiological arousal is occurring that is forcing reactive adaptations. These are not weighed, they're not evaluated, but they're automatic and reactionary. The adaptations are impacting the entirety of the body and the brain and nervous system. Again, just a reminder, children are not designed to be independent of their environment. They thrive or not based on the quality of their connectedness in the experiences of their environments. And so if you have children that are having problems, you're going to need to look first at the environment before you look at other things. Now, everybody wants it to be the fact that Johnny can't sit still in class and pay attention is the problem. But if Johnny's environments at home or school in his neighborhood are so that it keeps him constantly in a state of arousal, then expecting him to sit quietly in a classroom because it would be convenient for the teacher is irrational. So part of this, when you start understanding this from a different perspective, from a salutogenic point of view, you realize that the pathology view is responsible for a lot of indirect, subtle judgment and bias, and whether that's the child's behaving that way on purpose, or they should know better, or those kinds of things, all the way up to giving them diagnostic labels that are kind of negative. What are the absolutely correct biological responses you should see? Remember our metaphor of the ladder. If you have somebody that's in a sympathetic system dominance, what you should see is they're in the middle of the ladder somewhere. Their sympathetic nervous system is running the show. It's for fighting or running away. So you're going to see aggression and anger and controlling behaviors, sarcasm, threats, name calling, put downs, the use of intimidation to gain control over somebody or something, or you're going to see running away and fleeing and trying to act in ways to move away from this. Not the same thing as shutting down, which would be at the bottom of the ladder. So what are the behaviors you should see if this is, and again, we're talking about biologically correct responses. These are not good or bad behavior. They are correct biological responses. Are there social consequences? Absolutely. Are they annoying? Absolutely. But they're not bad behavior. And if we're going to help people kind of work with this, we have to stop reacting to those biologically correct responses. And instead of focusing on the thing that is annoying, we have to focus on how can we get them back at the top of the ladder. So if they're in the middle of the ladder, these are the things you should see. Why? Because they're biologically correct. Again, they're not socially appropriate or legal or attractive or desirable, and there's certainly wear and tear on any kind of social environment or social relationships. But these are not bad behavior. aggressive, angry, defensive, reactive, impulsive, hostile, irrational, self-centered, poor focused, delays in reaching different kinds of levels of maturity, irritability, anxiety, hyperactiveness, fidgety, can't sit still, gotta be moving all the time, drumming, whatever, to kind of get some kind of energy. You got all this energy your body's using to pump your system up. You're not going to sleep very well. You're going to have problems focusing your attention. Now, being around somebody that's angry is socially uncomfortable, and it makes it difficult to be in a social relationship with them. It can be offensive. Same with them being irrational or hostile. But it does not make it bad behavior. Bad behavior is volitional behavior, behavior that people are engaging in on purpose. This is not volitional behavior. This is biologically driven behavior. Now, people often kind of don't like that idea because we have been taught to think of anger and impulsivity as evidence that there's something wrong with their head or their character, and the reality is that falls far short. It's not even close to the truth. But it feels so nice and comfortable to say, well, that person cut me off in traffic, so they're just an asshole. Well, they're not. What they really did that was so horrible is made you afraid. And when they made you afraid, your response to that was to move down the ladder, and you got angry. You got angry because you got afraid. That had really nothing to do with them. You've cut people off in traffic, and you didn't do it volitionally. Now, are sometimes people jerks and do cut you off on purpose? Yes, absolutely. But most of the time, it's not that. And we react to it as if it is because it dysregulates us. So these are common, predictable, absolutely biologically correct. Are they difficult? Yes. Are they distressing to be around? Yes. Are they bad for you socially? Yes. Are they difficult on relationships? Yes. But they are not wrong. They are not bad. They are not sin. They're not bad behavior. They have bad consequences, but they are of themselves not bad behavior. The next piece, when we talk about mitigation, when you cannot immediately adapt and it's distressing, you have to do something. And the way our body manages that is it creates a space. Our body's having this experience. It finds it unpleasant. And so how does it deal with it? It can't fix it right now. It can't withdraw right now. It can't do the other strategies that would allow us to get some relief. So what it does is it creates a space between what your body is experiencing and your body's perception of that experience. And that this is a very common, half of the way we navigate the world as human beings is tied to this mitigating process. So what happens? I have a dear friend. They love a Canadian I'm in Phoenix. Hockey. They have a Canadian hockey team that they follow, and man, they can talk about these people's stats and the games and who's won. They can talk about it going back 10 or 12 years. And here I am. I grew up in Arizona. We had hockey here, but it's not something any of us really kind of grew up playing. I'm not interested in hockey at all. In fact, I find it incredibly boring. This doesn't mean that it is boring. I find it boring. So when my friend starts talking about, this team that he loves, I like my friend. I don't want to lose the friendship, but I don't want to hear about the hockey team either. So what do we do? What do you do in situations like that? I'll bet you do what I do. Your mind goes on a little space creating adventure. You think about what you're going to do this weekend. You think about, work assignments you need to make sure you write down, or you think about, maybe if you're out someplace socially, Maybe the dessert menu looks, you're thinking about that, but you're thinking about everything else, anything else to distract you or to give you space from that situation. You can't withdraw because you threaten the relationship, but you aren't interested, you aren't invested, you don't like hockey, you don't care for it. So you're not going to, how do you tolerate that experience? You do it by creating mental space. Now, if you can't create enough space to get free, what you can do is create more space. And you can create more space. And you can create more and more distance to the point where at the extreme version of mitigation, you're actually dissociating, have a lack of personal awareness, or have become totally depersonalized. Now, that's the extreme version of it. But the mechanism of mitigation that leads to disassociation, there's nothing wrong with that at all. It's absolutely correct behavior. Think of it this way. Have you ever had a bad sunburn or cut yourself or had a toothache or a headache, sprained an ankle, or you got a good thumbnail whack when you meant to hit a hammer and you smashed your thumb? Your body received a wound and an insult there. So your body adapts. It does it automatically. So you have a bad sunburn. What are you going to do the next day? Stay out of the sun? Wear looser, lighter clothing? Avoid contact with people? Are you going to be a little bit more grouchy for people, annoying you? If somebody touches you and they're doing it on purpose because they know you're in pain, are you going to get angry with them? Of course you are. If I got angry with somebody because I've got a sunburn and they touch me and they know I have a sunburn and they're doing it because they think it's funny and I get angry with them, am I engaging in bad behavior? Or is that a predictable response because my body is feeling all this overwhelm? And you got to start thinking differently. If you've got people with trauma histories, you just can't assume the simplistic answer, because what mitigating does is it reduces future distress. In other words, I'm feeling distressed. I don't want to feel distressed. I'll take this action. It will relieve my stress, and the relief I get from doing something releases a dopamine cascade, which means I'm more likely to do it again. So that's a mitigating behavior. It's a risk reduction behavior. The body is trying not to have that negative experience again, whether it's a memory or a real wound or a social experience, anything that's created real discomfort and distress for our human system. We're going to try to intervene in some way biologically. It's not a choice we're making, biologically, to reduce risk. And one of the ways that we can do that, again, not as a choice, but just as part of our natural reactive process, is to mitigate. So you get a bad sunburn, you're going to rub aloe vera on it. You're going to do some kind of topical analgesic. If you have an extremely bad headache, you may use, Excedrin or ibuprofen or some other pain reliever. If you have a bad toothache and you can't get to the dentist, you can always get clove oil and put clove oil on it. And all of these things don't do anything to reduce the pain that the nerve is shooting off. What it does is it blocks your perception of the pain. And that is a mitigating process. We rely on mitigating processes constantly. And yet in the mental health field, we've been taught to think of mitigating as a dissociative thing that is bad behavior, that is a sign of mental illness. It is not a sign of mental illness. Used to an extreme, it has consequences that are problematic, but it is not good, bad, right, wrong, healthy, unhealthy behavior. It is exactly a correct biological response. So, what happens when you're at the bottom of the ladder? which is where you're probably going to be mitigating most, is you're all about conservation of energy. You're all about passive defenses, being anesthetized, shut down. You're going to numb out, shut down, hide, feel small, um, not want to be seen, not want to feel things, not to have thoughts or feelings or ideas. You're certainly going to withhold those from folks. So if you're at the bottom of the ladder, there's absolutely correct responses that you should see. If you're working with somebody and they're at the bottom of the ladder, you should see predictable behaviors, and these are what they are. You should see freezing, feeling stuck, disassociation. You should see emotional numbing, distraction, self-soothing. You're going to find a lot more addictions, self-injury, suicidality, compulsive behavior here, a lot of reactivity, a lot of sadness, a lot of emotional and psychological distancing from other people, a lot of difficulty feeling attached or secure in any relationship. So that's what we've been trained to think of, is that these are psychological problems or psychiatric problems. And we think of the active, overt, the sympathetic system stuff, the middle of the ladder stuff. We've been taught to think of those as bad behavior. The reality is different. They are neither bad behavior or psychiatric issues. These are predictable biological responses. And what we need to look at is, how do we get people to the place where we can help them move up to the top of the ladder and stay relatively up at the top of the ladder the most of their time? And that's a huge task, and it's one that we really need to be skilled at doing. So as you experience a limbic shift, it changes you. It changes you in specific, predictable ways. It changes your emotions, your thinking, and behavior. So we have a term for that in the medical world. It's called dysautonomia. Dysautonomia is any kind of symptoms that emerge as a result of the autonomic nervous system being out of balance, and being out of balance persistently. So when the sympathetic and parasympathetic system are out of balance and the sympathetic system is dominant for long periods of time, what you're going to find is the emergence of symptoms. And these can result from any number of things, certainly diseases such as diabetes or an injury, particularly a brain injury, poisoning, toxins in the environment, trauma, and adversity. All can create dysautonomia. I also should include kind of genetic, there can be problems with genetic expression that lead to dysautonomia. The treatment for dysautonomia is really interesting, and you don't see the diagnosis very often because it's not a medication-driven treatment. It is really educate people about their body, develop body awareness and body self-management skills. So let me see if I can put this in a different way for you. So you have a family member and they're 22, 23 years old, pretty young, and they have some kind of an attack, and you go to the doctor and you find out that they have diabetes. And so now we can't really fix diabetes. I mean, we can do a lot of things to health style-wise to improve it, but if people have that, it's now a medical condition that is driving this. What do? We teach people to pay attention, to increase their awareness to their own body, to be able to recognize when certain things are beginning to change and what they mean. And we teach them self-management skills so that they can regulate themselves better. And that's what we have to do whenever dysautonomia is part of a medical diagnosis. But somehow in the mental health world, we've strayed from this idea. We have people that are emerging symptoms because their biology is in a state of arousal, and instead of us focusing on that, we start looking for the hole in the head or the deficit of character We assign it a label. We want to give them a medication, and we haven't really done the groundwork to help them actually be able to deal with this, which is educate them about the body, help them increase body awareness, and develop self-management skills. And that's really a problem um, in the way we conceptualize mental health. It's also tremendously important if you're going to be working with trauma to realize that most of the time in trauma, you're dealing with dysautonomia. It's not an event, it's something that happened that pushed this body out of the ability to be in a regulated state and generally has kept it that way for a while. That can certainly happen with a single event, but most often it's happening with repetitive histories of toxic stress, adversity, and multiple traumas. In the mental health world and trauma treatment, we've known since 1992 that we needed to approach trauma differently. In her book, Trauma and Recovery, Judith Herman clearly sent out a clarion call to people in the mental health world. Before you treat trauma, you must get them calm, which is they have to feel safe and they have to be stable. What does that really mean? They have to be at the top of the ladder. They have to be in Bruce Banner brain or Einstein brain or the unicorn brain. They have to be at the top of the ladder in order to move forward and do trauma resolution work. So that was her number one thing. Number two was work through trauma using some kind of narrative exposure while keeping people calm, and then re-engage them in meaningful life or reconnect them to things that are life-affirming. Well, that makes sense. We have lots of people that have been trained in models of treatment, and they think that the treatment is the model. But what they fail to understand quite often is that if you can get somebody calm in their own body to where they feel safe in their own body and they're able to regulate themselves pretty well, just about any model of treatment will work well for them. And if you're not doing that, you're going to have really differential results on trauma on the treatment part, the application of your model of treatment. So I really want to encourage people to think about this a little differently, because what we're suggesting is if you're working with dysautonomia, you have to get them in a calm body. They have to be able to access their executive functioning system. They have to be able to be aware in order to be intentional, in order to take consistent action. You can only do that at the top of the ladder. So, earlier we talked about the problems with cortisol. What are they again? First, they reduce dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and endorphins. Next, they reduce your ability to reality check. As the level of cortisol goes up, your executive functioning goes down. As the level of cortisol goes up, your ability to stop yourself or inhibit behavior goes down. Your ability to use logic and reason go down. As your cortisol level increases, you're going to have trouble forming sequential memory. Well, these are kind of significant problems, folks. We need the whole brain to work together well. And when it doesn't happen, we lose significant abilities. And some of those abilities that are challenged are these: the ability to create discrete differences in our experience. So if you've worked with a trauma client, you'll see somebody that may have difficulty telling the difference between being angry and frustrated, or being, liking and love. I mean, they have really trouble making distinctions, and they tend to kind of put things in big groups and don't distinguish them very well. You have difficulty in reality checking if your cortisol levels are high. Well, what's the problem with that? You can't be adequately self-reflective and self-evaluating if you can't reality check. What's it going to impact in your school and learning process if if you can't create sequential memory or serialized learning, everything in education is set up in sequence or serialized. A, B, C, D, E, F, G is a sequence. 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a sequence. We learn most of our academic stuff through sequence. If I'm a kid and my body's pumped full of cortisol, the likelihood of me being able to do that is really impaired. The different parts of the brain aren't going to be integrating very well. You're going to have reduced cognitive flexibility because your cognitive and flexibility improves as you are at the top of the ladder and decreases as you move down. You're going to have a reduced ability to stop bad behavior because the system that's required to inhibit or stop a behavior is taken offline. You're not going to have much logic or reason, and you're not going to plan very well. That's what happens when cortisol increases in your system. Now, if that one hormone and neurochemical is that impactful, and you're dealing with approximately 30 or so of these that are really influential, what are the others doing that you don't know? And how much of your client's behavior is actually biologically correct, but you have been trained to see them as being broken or having a hole in their head or having some deficit of character as part of your thought process. We need to expunge that out of the mental health world. You cannot do therapy when somebody's hippocampus is offline because it's been pumped full of cortisol. You can't do therapy with the Hulk. You cannot do therapy with the Frankenstein. And you certainly cannot do therapy with the dragon. To try to do so is just problematic. And what we tend to do in the mental health world, we're trying to do therapy with this dragon, and the dragon just isn't making any progress, so it must be a problem with the dragon. It couldn't be a problem with our delivery and our understanding of what we're dealing with. And what I've experienced over the years, it's usually my failure if the client is feeling overwhelmed or they're not making progress. So cortisol doesn't require a big bad event. More often than not, it's the result of repeated adversity, toxic stress environments, traumatic events, and stressful relationships. Well, you look at that list and you can see a lot of room for people having some, too much cortisol in their system. All are enough to flood the system with cortisol and affect the brain and nervous system. Now, these are environments that we know are particularly provocative for generating cortisol and stress hormones in the body. We call it the cumulative harm effect. Any chaotic environment is going to create stress. Whether it's a home, a classroom, a corporate office, a freeway, chaos for human beings creates stress. If you're in an environment where there's a lot of aggressiveness, you're going to be producing a lot of cortisol. If you're in an environment where it's very punitive, you're going to be producing a lot of cortisol. So let me kind of give you a picture of this. You're a kid that lives in an environment that's, relatively unstable. I mean, you've got a lot of tension and toxic stress in the home, and for whatever reason. And you go to school, and you're just really high in cortisol, and you go into a classroom with too many kids, a teacher that feels overwhelmed, a teacher that uses a very aggressive methods to try to manage the classroom, and punishes when they don't get compliance or acquiescence. And that punishment often is shame-based. So if I am an active, adaptive kid, in other words, I'm a person that my sympathetic system says, take action, try to get control, be aggressive, be assertive. and I have a teacher communicate in an aggressive and punitive way with me, I'm going to have a reaction to it. Is it because I'm a bad kid? Nope. Is it because the teacher's a bad teacher? Nope. But you're dealing with a teacher that's so overwhelmed they cannot regulate themselves well in that environment, much less regulate their students. And when I say regulate, I'm not talking about dictatorial control. With traumatized folks or people that have these kinds of imbalances, the interaction has to be relational. There has to be an understanding of connection there that you can use. But if you're going to a classroom and you've got 35 kids and you've got a teacher that's got her own kids and is not feeling so well, or that he's working two jobs, or he's got other things, other demands on his system, neither of those teachers is going to be very useful, because if they're overwhelmed, then they're going to respond reactively to anything that happens, and they're going to be likely to be aggressive and punitive. Well, what's that going to do to the kid? If it's the kid that's a mitigator, he's just going to put his head down, shut down, check out, and he's not going to be a problem. But the other kid is going to get in your face, and they're going to be on their way to the office, and they're in trouble. And so what we end up with is the label of lazy kid or bad kid, the unmotivated student or the rebellious student. The reality is very different than that. It is the environment isn't set up to help them de-escalate the level of arousal they have. Add to that any kind of inconsistent practices where we say one thing and do another, and any kind of instability. This could be instability of relationships, employment, residential, financial, any kind of instability can really amp that up. So I was kind of having this discussion with somebody, and I was talking about the typical mental health clinic that is driven by encounter value. It tends to be very chaotic, and they're always kind of vacillating between aggressive means, if your notes aren't turned in on time, or if you don't do this, here's the consequence, and they're kind of punitive, and they're, you're supposed to be doing it this way, blah, blah, blah. A lot of times the policies shift at the convenience of your authority figures in your organization. And we find a lot of mental health people burning out of jobs because the environments are chaotic, aggressive, punitive, inconsistent, and really relatively unstable. And so it's not surprising you'd have companies where they're experiencing those hit a 40-50% turnover rate. Well, and of course, what the company does is blame the therapist. Well, for some reason, we're not getting good therapists. No, that's not it at all. You haven't created the right environment. And when you go in and do trauma-informed organizational work, what you're doing is working with the leadership to eliminate these from the work environment. And often when you start having those conversations, they don't know how else to manage. And so it's really a challenge for them. Again, how does your dragon get created? How does it get sustained? All the above environments create dragons and sustain dragons. If you don't want a dragon, don't have this kind of environment. Even in, I know a lot of the work that Sandy Bloom does for the sanctuary model. They'll work with schools 2-3 years to help and what you're basically doing is focusing on the faculty and management and staff eliminating these environments from their school, and instead focus on building nurtured, safe, well-attached relationships with the faculty and staff to the students. It's not a hole in the head or a deficit of character that we are dealing with most of the time. It is a biological responses. So we are dealing with completely correct biological responses, yes? Are the completely biologically correct responses that are driving behavior annoying, disruptive, unpleasant, difficult to tolerate? And the answer is absolutely. But that does not make them bad people. It does not make it bad behavior. It is just biological responses. If you want to change that, you have to help them manage their body differently. It is not bad simply because it's annoying, disruptive, unpleasant, difficult to tolerate. In our society, like most human societies, we tend to pathologize, label, shame, and blame them for our dysregulation. Did you catch that? We tend to blame others because we aren't capable of regulating ourselves. And that's a very human thing to do. So as we kind of move through this, when people are in the middle or lower parts of the ladder, how should they act that is correct behavior? And we've kind of been talking about that. When someone is in their Einstein brain and has moved from Einstein brain into Frankenstein brain, how should they emote or think or behave? That's what we've been answering this morning, or in this early part of the training. When someone has fled Bruce Banner brain and are thoroughly in Hulk brain, how will they emote or think or behave? Now, I'm using all of the metaphors there, or not all of them, but most of the metaphors there, because I really am trying to nail that point. We've got to step away from thinking of people as having a deficit in their head or their character, and move away from being problem focused to wellness focused, to really help people that have trauma histories have the greatest potential. People being raised or currently living in toxic stress environments are building neural pathways that are Hulkish, Frankensteinish, and absolutely not at the top of the ladder. In other words, the experiences they're having are building their nervous system. And so what's going to seem familiar, what's going to seem comfortable, what's going to be their comfort zone are these patterns that are built. Most of these patterns begin to be built well before the age of 3 years old, and they continue to persist. This is why we're often dealing with an accumulative effect where the stressors began early in life and have progressed throughout life at various times, more or less, but the stress or what's going on keeps that system in a state of arousal. They're dysregulated. And so they're not at the top of the ladder. They're Hulkish or Frankensteinish or Dragonish, and that's kind of what you're left with. So this kind of completes the section on hormones and neurochemicals. What we're going to go into next is kind of a more dive into the mechanics of how all of this works. In this section, we're going to talk about how trauma gets created. It's just a very simplified overview because I'm not doing a real deep dive into it. But a lot of the concepts I'm going to cover will have an impact on how we are structuring the SafeNet delivery. So let's go ahead and begin with this and see if we can't set the stage for you to be able to use this to help your client move through their narrative. So as long as we are in this range of tolerance, and what that is basically is that place where we are resilient. As long as we're within that range of tolerance, we can experience negative, painful, distressing things without becoming overwhelmed by them. The challenge is that the range of tolerance is not fixed. It is in a constant state of fluctuation. As hormones change in your system, so does your range of tolerance. As if you're tired or you don't feel well, your range of tolerance is affected. A lot of people fail to understand that the number one impact on the range of tolerance is the state of the body at this time. So when you have people that are suffering, kind of prolonged illnesses, that have been under stress for a while, their range of tolerance is more than likely going to be much smaller than somebody else that isn't going through that kind of thing. And as we exceed the upper level of the range of tolerance, what happens is that as the range of tolerance is either reducing or we're moving towards the top end of that, it creates more changes in our brain, nervous system, body, and those changes further impact the range of tolerance. So when we are getting doses of neurochemicals and hormones in our body, and the effect of it is reducing our range of tolerance, then things we might normally take in stride seem overwhelming. And what happens is as we move past the upper range of tolerance, then our Hulk system, if you will, our strategic defense system, our self-protective system is going to kick in. And as we move up above that range of tolerance, we're going to be in a full-blown, if you will, full-blown disarray, and we're going to engage in some behaviors that are absolutely biologically correct, but they have tremendous social consequences. So as our hormonal and neurochemical systems shift, we move towards the upper limit of our range of tolerance. And that's kind of an important piece, because we can have something happen, and if we have a good range of tolerance, it'll happen, we can move past it. But that same thing happens when we have a reduced range of tolerance, and it's like a nuclear explosion occurred. Most everybody's experienced this, but they didn't have this kind of mindset on it. You've all had one of those weeks where things have just been stressing you all week, and somebody does or says something or looks at you in a certain way, and you are over the top angry about it. However, the same thing might have been said a few weeks before when you had a good range of tolerance and you thought it was funny, or you just kind of laughed it off. So we often think that that's a mental health problem, and it isn't. It's a biology problem. And if your system, your range of tolerance is really constricted, then you're going to be finding yourself above it very often. And when we exceed the upper range of tolerance, we engage in what we consider to be reactive adaptations and mitigations. So let's talk a little bit about those and see if this can make sense to you. Remember that reactive adaptations and mitigations are not conscious choices, but are biologically correct reactions. We spent quite a bit of time talking about that in the prior section, but it's important to kind of carry the theme through. So these reactions are autopilot responses wired into our brains and nervous system. So if we spend a lot of time above our threshold limit, above the threshold limit, and above the threshold limit, then our body is building reactions in the neurocircuitry of our brains and nervous system that are going to become autopilot reactions, and we'll engage in them without any real conscious choice or thought. Now, that's really irritating, because when we see people in our presence that are doing things that irritate us, it's really easy to say, well, they're doing that on purpose just to irritate me, or they should know better, or can't they see how bad this is? And we really get kind of in that judgmental space because it's inconveniencing us in some way. But the reality is that if their range of tolerance is small and they are pushed above it repeatedly or continuously or frequently, they have built new neural pathways that are tied to being responsive to that system. So particularly people that have early life trauma or early life toxic stress environments or repeated adversity are building, if you want to think of it this way, flesh and blood structures in their brain and nervous system to help them deal with overwhelm. And once they're built, we just run on them automatically. And that's what's happening here. If somebody's stays in their threshold, within their range of tolerance pretty well, then they've built neural pathways on ways to do that. But if they have spent a lot of time above that threshold, they've also built neural pathways around that. And the neural pathways that get used the most often are going to be the most autopilot responses that we have. So that's an important concept to kind of keep in mind. So what's happening is we're moving through this trauma adversity cycle. We go from being regulated to dysregulated to re-regulated. And this is just natural human stuff. This is not mental illness. This is not a pathology. It's not a problem. It is just the cycle that is biologically driven. We're in a state of quiescence, and we're having very little demand for food or water or sleep or whatever. And we move into a state of dysregulation, and our system comes on, and it's going to act in some way. And then as we get that met, we're going to be re-regulated. So you can think of this as you wake up and you're not immediately hungry. You get up and do some things, and then you realize you're hungry, and now your system is moving into a dysregulated state. And if you go eat, then your body will move back into a re-regulated state. Or you're a baby and you're fairly comfortable. You're feeling full, you're not distressed in any way, and you are in your own waste product, and it becomes uncomfortable. You become dysregulated, you fuss and cry. Some adult in that or caregiver in that world comes and changes you, comforts you a little bit, and you become re-regulated. So these are not just physical things that dysregulate. If I have an unmet need for a sustained amount of time, let's say the need for connection with somebody else, or a need to feel a sense of belonging, and it isn't met, then it's going to dysregulate me. And until I get re-regulated, I'm not going to be able to function all that well. This is just normal human stuff. It's not good, bad, right, wrong. It's just something we need to be aware of. And where does trauma emerge is when people move into a dysregulated state and get stuck there. And the longer they're in that space, the more likely we are to see symptomatic behavior, thinking, and emotions emerge. So I call that being stuck in the Hulk brain. And as long as you're there, you are not going to learn well, you're not going to problem solve well, you're basically just reacting to the dysregulation in your system. And in order to get re-regulated, we have to get back within our range of tolerance. And so it's important to kind of get a handle on this idea, because how many times are you working with people that come into your offices, or you see them in a classroom, or they're in a cubicle in an office next to you, and they're in Hulk mode. And until they can regulate themselves, re-regulate, they're going to stay in Hulk mode. And that's problematic in a number of ways, because they're not going to behave rationally. They're going to be impulsive. They're going to be, they can be very hostile. They can be very aggressive. And it isn't that this isn't chosen behavior. It is the result of being in this dysregulated state. So, but as the one that's getting the experience of that from another person, we tend to see it as they have chosen to behave this way. And a lot of our programming and a lot of our conceptualization of problems is based on that idea that this is an intentional behavior. That is not true for the most part. And by believing that, it actually limits our ability to really move in and help folks re-regulate. So what is happening to the body that has had a dose after dose after dose after dose after dose of the fiery cocktail of neurochemicals and hormones that push people into arousal? Why is this problematic for people? because as soon as they get over their range of tolerance, they no longer are able to do executive functioning very effectively. In other words, they can't create distinctions. They can't create serial memories very well. They can't use logic very well. They're not self-reflective very well. They're not self-evaluating very well. They have difficulty inhibiting their behavior. Why? Because all of those things are congruent with being above the threshold and having your body flooded with those hormones that we talked about earlier, the noradrenaline, adrenaline, and cortisol. So a lot of the behaviors that we deal with in education, in families, in mental health, in just about any venue of work where you're working with other people, it's really easy to get to the point where you're seeing that as truly bad behavior rather than biologically correct responses. So because it is building neurocircuitry in your brain and nervous system, if they're in disarray very often, if they're above the threshold very often, that neurocircuitry that's been built is becoming a very fluent, very accessible autopilot. If I figure, and I'm just going to play with this a little bit, if I am only within my range of tolerance for an hour or two a day, then most of my neurocircuitry is built outside of that. And those autopilots that I engage in are going to be kind of problematic for other people, problematic for me as well, but they're built outside of the range of tolerance. And what we really want to do is build a lot of neurocircuitry within the range of tolerance. And in order for people to be able to do that, they have to be able to stay in a regulated state. In other words, they have to stay in their Einstein, Bruce Banner, with the top of the ladder, however you want to refer to it. You have to stay at the top of the ladder in order to be able to build neurocircuitry within the range of tolerance. Because all of the neurocircuitry we build above the range of tolerance is going to be reactive and not employ executive functioning very well. So this is really the term that I want to spend some time with, traumagenesis. What's really happening is the creation of trauma. And in traditional mental health terms, we've thought of trauma as being a big, bad, ugly event. And now that we have more science and understanding, what we realize is certainly an event can be problematic. Why is it problematic? Is because it pushes people above their threshold, and because of the nature of the thing, they stay above threshold so long that they begin to generate symptoms. But you don't need a big bad event to have trauma. Trauma is simply the symptoms that emerge when people are above threshold, and if they're above threshold enough, they've built neurocircuitry of autopilot neurocircuitry, and so that becomes a traumagenesis. In other words, they're engaging in trauma symptoms repeatedly because that's the way their nervous system has been built. It's not a conscious choice. They're not doing it because it's fun. They're not doing it because they're intentionally trying to piss people off. It is just the nature of it. You cannot change that before your client, your child, your spouse, your student is regulating well. So, repeated activation of the threat-stress response system will drive a reactive adaptation and mitigation. The nervous system becomes chronically overactivated and a cumulative harm effect is created. In other words, if all your neurocircuitry is being developed outside of your range of tolerance, then what you're really experiencing is a cumulative harm effect, because the strategies to get through the moment are not ones that are going to help you thrive. They're reactive systems, they're defensive systems. And the more you use them, the more the more easily they are accessed by us, and the more likely we are to use them. So we can have reactive adaptations and mitigations to reduce our immediate stress, but in the long run, they prove to be unhealthy. That's why we call it a cumulative harm effect. Activation does not require abuse, abandonment, physical or sexual hurts. Just repeated perception of threat is adequate to generate trauma symptoms. Well, when you start looking at this from this perspective, you realize that most psychiatric diagnostic problems are really trouble with over-adaptation, under-adaptation, mitigation, and a lot of the symptoms that we are kind of checking off to give a diagnosis really have more to do with their physiological arousal and the traumagenesis that occurs because of that, rather than any intrapsychic, any kind of hole in the head or a poor character. And as long as we continue to focus on that traditional kind of mindset that's prominent in the psychology world, is that it's a deficit here or a deficit in your character that's the problem, we're going to underserve people that have histories of repetitive arousal. So the brain is organized around several concepts. Hierarchy, there's a hierarchy to how it works. A lot of what it's perceiving is perceived at a non-conscious, what we call a neuroceptive, in other words, molecular or cellular awareness of what's going on, and that it's going to seek co-regulation. So let's walk through each of these a little bit and see if I can explain them in a simple way for us. So the hierarchy, the nervous system responds to sensations in the body that come from the environment and the body's perception of what's going on in that environment and what it means. So we talked about these terms when we gave you the metaphor of the ladder. The dorsal vagal system, that's your shutdown, your immobilization. You have your sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight or flight system. You have your ventral vagal system, which is your social engagement, connection. This is co-regulation occurs in the ventral vagal system. Another way of looking at this is this hierarchy is always going to be functioning on safety and energy conservation. So as we kind of move forward, what we're looking at is in neuroception, these are autonomic nervous systems that our body has, and they function quite well outside of our conscious mind. Neuroception isn't subconscious, it's non-conscious. Most of what the body is perceiving is based on prior learning experience. Not learning like, Johnny, remember this, but from the experiences that they've had in various environments and the meanings that they've made of those experiences. And that becomes, so that the neuroception is always kind of paying attention to the environment and reacting accordingly. The signals that the body is sensitized to pay attention to, again, has a lot to do with the learning history of the person. If the learning history has been relatively negative, if they've spent a lot of time above the threshold, if they've had a lot of repetitive or prolonged toxic stress, then what is happening is that this is being perceived in the body at a non-conscious subcortical automatic system. And it isn't a choice, it's the body responding to the environment. Now that makes people really uncomfortable because we want to believe in the deepest part of our heart that the problem is a choice. They've thought about it, they're doing it, and they're doing it on purpose, and they can change that if they want to. And when we start saying that it is not a choice so much, but it is the body's learning history of what the what the environment is triggering in them, that really opens up a whole different kind of thought process, because then we begin to realize that in order to really help people move through and thrive, we have to be focused at least significantly on the maintenance of the environment. How do we reduce stress in this environment? How do we stabilize the environments so that the body isn't perceiving threat all the time? This is really tough when you're working with families, because you have highly dysregulated parents raising highly dysregulated children, and the parents are terrified that they might be blamed for what their child is doing or experiencing, and so they're really in a defensive state. And the reality is that until you can stabilize the parents, the likelihood of being able to stabilize the child is very poor. But most programming kind of ignores that fact and focuses on, let's give therapy to the child. And yet the child's behavior is actually quite often biologically correct responses to living in an environment that is overwhelmed and stressed. And they've built their early developmental neural pathways around being in that constant state of arousal. So, that makes people feel uncomfortable. And parents will say, well, you're just blaming the parent for this. And I am not blaming the parents. I'm just talking about, from a biological point of view, a child cannot outregulate a dysregulated environment. In fact, most adults have problems doing that. And a child with less skills and less ability is even less successful at being able to do that. So it is a big demand we put on children that are living day to day in highly provocative environments that are constantly stressful for them. And then we expect that they're going to come and sit down in the classroom and be good little students and pay attention. That is such an irrational belief that we have punished, shamed, and blamed children for generations for not being able to be regulated and calm and learn well. And that is an environmental influence first. In order to help them learn most efficiently, the environment has to be one that's calm, warm, nurturing, stable, predictable, and where the adults have a relationship with each child. And I'm not saying, a role, that they have to have a relationship, because it's going to be through relationship that we find people can calm and move up to that ventral vagal, the top of the ladder. We don't teach that very well in our society, and that's problematic. So that's neuroception. Our nervous system is the foundation of our lived experience and the meaning that we give those experiences. We don't really have a choice. If I'm constantly having an experience that every environment I walk into is dangerous, and you are a well-meaning therapist tell me you are safe here, I am going to probably doubt you significantly, because that's what people say just before they take advantage of you. And that is based on my learning history, not your words. And we forget that what's going to be the person's truth is their meaning that they have given their life experiences. And most of that is going to be if they have had a whole life of toxic stress, adversity, and traumas, most of those meanings and experiences are above their range of tolerance. So they've built whole nervous system to be ready to be defensive and reactive. And then we run into that and we say things like this: well, they're not motivated, or they're not compliant, or they aren't serious about this, or they don't really want to change. And all of those are untrue ways to protect our collective egos, because the truth is we are inadequate to connect with these people. A lot of that is because we don't have our own stuff worked through all the way. But a lot of it is that we have an expectation that isn't rational based on what's popular in society rather than what's based on the science that we're dealing with. Our neuroscaffolding allows us to learn from our experiences. Each relationship, each experience, and action leads the autonomic nervous system to learn more about the world. This is primarily how our synaptic system works. We're experiencing something and we connect things, we make memories, we learn how to use this body, and that's happening from even prior to being born. It's happening in the brain and nervous system of the unborn child all the way through our life. Earlier in our life, we are more quickly adapting to that, but we're having this process go on all the time. So every response that we make is in service to survival. Now, nobody really likes to hear that because they want to think that they're altruistic, and some really wonderful people are altruistic, but there's still a survival feature in their work. May not be their personal survival, but there's certainly a survival aspect to it. And when you're dealing with behavior or thinking or emoting from people, and often looks so incongruous, you kind of like, my gosh, that's so weird. What's going on with that person? And you don't perceive the action from their point of view. You perceive it from an outsider's point of view. But we know as a point of fact that most action in the autonomic nervous system is going to be survival oriented first. If they can stay in their range of tolerance and they're thriving, then they will have alternative responses. But we are designed by nature to be survival-oriented creatures. This is why trauma therapists will always seek safety and stability of their clients first. Now, I'm going to broaden that out. If you're a teacher, you need to ensure that the classroom you have is safe, not by your perception, but by their perception. And it needs to be stable and predictable and routine. It also needs to be warm and nurturing, and there has to be a relationship between the teacher and each child. And that's really tough because the children that are the most difficult are the ones that need connection the most. And they're the ones that tend to be minimized, ignored, or punished. The same thing is true with parents. The same thing is true with workers in an environment. If you really want the best from people, they have to feel safe. They have to feel stable. And when we go in and work with companies around trauma and becoming a trauma-informed company, this is one of the things, the big discussions we have with leadership is, how are you building safety and stability for your employee? Because until you can achieve that environment, the likelihood of their providing the highest quality of care for your client is very poor. Well, that's a different mindset for most organizations. Your client has built many, many patterns. They've built them throughout their life. Many of those patterns may have been built when they were above threshold. And what that really means is that many of our clients' thinking, emoting, and behaving are operating in non-conscious patterns. These are patterns that are occurring without conscious decision making. They even often are outside of our awareness. And we all engage in automatic behavior. How many times have you found yourself, with, today you've decided not to drink as much coffee and you're on your way to work and you pull into your familiar Starbucks? Or you find yourself, you're on a diet of some kind and you walk by the store, you're in the store and you walk by the pastry thing and donuts just jump into your basket. You look at them and you go, how did those get there? These are built non-conscious patterns. And until we can get somebody at the top of the ladder, Bruce Banner brain or Einstein brain, they're going to engage in autopilot, which is procedural and implicit memory circuits. We want to help them create actual transformation in their lives. They cannot do that in the autopilot system. Whenever new patterns are built, earlier or more primitive patterns are still available and will come forward whenever the body experiences stress. In other words, we'll move down the ladder of dysregulation. We always have the ability to move up or down, and even though we've built a new pattern up at the top, the moment we move down, we're going to access old patterns. So you might think of, if you have a 10-rung ladder, you know, the first two or three rungs of that ladder, you've built patterns there, but you only can access those patterns when you are at the top of the ladder. And as you move down the ladder, let's say steps 5 or 6, you have patterns built there too. And if you had an early life history of trauma, toxic stress, or adversity, you have lots of patterns built there. Or if it was really egregious for you, it'd be down at the bottom of the ladder. You have lots of patterns built there. For most of us, we have more patterns in the middle and lower part of the ladder than at the top of the ladder, because we spend less time at the top of the ladder. So I hope that kind of makes sense. A lot of what we are doing is just autopilot experiences. So here's my question to you. Do you have clients that fail to sustain change or they relapse? And how often have we been taught, whether that's in school or in mental health or in many other, in work environments, when somebody fails to sustain a change and relapse, don't we get critical of them? Yet, for most of us, it is a process of successive progress, not, we don't get it and just get it in the first try and are able to sustain it forever. The most sustainable actions we take and the most conscious we take are at the top of the ladder. Everything else pretty much is autopilot. And so when you start looking at that, you look at your own behavior. How much of it is actually intentional, deliberate behavior? Do you, through an act of will, decide to fill your bladder? Do you, through an act of will, change the amount of glutamate that's being affected by the insulin in your system? I mean, most of what we do is automatic, and a lot of it is instinctual. However, we do have the ability to get to the top of the ladder. But people with histories of toxic stress, adversity, and trauma are going to have difficulty doing that because most of their neural pathways have been built outside the range of tolerance. Many of your clients' thinking, emoting, and behaving are non-conscious. It requires a tremendous amount of focus to build new patterns. And the reality is, it becomes more difficult when we get distracted, or we get dysregulated, or we fail to maintain our focus. The moment you lose focus, you go back to prior learning. If I'm not being intentional, what do I go back to? Old, automatic, autopilot behavior. Let me say that one more time. The moment I lose focus, I go back to autopilot. In order to stay in a trajectory of transformation, whether that's learning something new, feeling better, creating change in your life, being more successful at a project, you have to be able to stay in a focused state. And the moment you lose focus, you're going to go back to old automatic behavior. Why? Because that's the way our nervous system works. The change is difficult because it requires that on-purpose, intentional focus. And anything that interrupts that intentional focus is going to move us down the ladder, and we're going to engage in more autopilot behavior. And so this is really vital for us to kind of comprehend. And my graphic isn't working. So we will skip this one. It basically says that the whole world, it's an image of the world, and what it says behind it is, we live in a non-conscious world. So, facts you need to know. We are not primarily rational beings. Did you catch that? We are not primarily rational beings. The primitive non-conscious processes run the majority of our lives. Neural pathways have been constructed based on our interaction with the environment. If our interactions with the environment are occurring while we're in our range of tolerance, we're building good neural pathways there. If our neural pathways are being built above our range of tolerance, remember, once they are built, we run on them automatically, like our autopilot. These are what we call non-declarative memory structures. Your body wants to use the lowest amount of energy it can in your brain functioning. Let me say it one more time. Your body, remember, it's designed to conserve energy. Your body wants to use the lowest amount of energy it can in the brain to function. And when you are focused and you're being intentional, you are demanding a great deal of energy be used. The safety system, or the primitive brain threat response, will perceive high energy demand as a threat and act in a way to pull you out of that. In other words, and I'm gonna put this a little bit differently. You're in your dragon system, and you've climbed up the ladder, and you're now being intentional and you're focused, but you are really putting a drain on the body's energy system, because thinking, particularly intentionality, is very, very energy demanding. So what happens is that the dragon perceives that as a threat and will do everything it can to pull you out of that high energy use. It wants you to move back down into the low energy use, which is, let's run on autopilot again. And that's not a choice. It is a loss. When you lose focus, you're going to move back to primitive, less effective behaviors. Why? Because it's easy. We can do that on autopilot. We don't have to be thinking about it. So your non-conscious brain, which is I'm going to label that your Frankenstein, your Hulk, your dragon brain, and that's I'm kind of using that as a metaphor. Don't get too hung up on the precision of it. It's just a metaphor. And this brain is lightning fast. It is really quick. It's processing most everything within about 1/5 of a second. And if it's something that's happened repetitively, that speed will even be higher. This is basically a sensory and environment-based perception. How am I feeling, and what's going on out here that's making me feel this way? And I'm learning from that. We are operating in instinction, with instincts and emotion here. We are habituated. A lot of this is what we call procedural memory or implicit memory, autopilot, if you will. It is, once it's habituated, what is built into that habituated autopilot response is all the sensory and emotional memory that goes with it. And this is one of the reasons we're going to approach the SafeNet way of processing a narrative the way we do, because a lot of times you imagine what you get when you ask somebody, tell me your story. You get the habituated sensory and emotional embedded memory, and what ends up happening is rather than talking about the memory from the point of view of an observer, we trigger a reactivation of that whole sensory and emotional memory, which is problematic for your client. We're operating with low levels of cognitive energy on the non-conscious brain. Now, conscious brain, super slow. It's conceptual and it's or information based. It's thinking thoughts. It is memory that is serialized in a context. In other words, this happened before this happened, before this happened, before this happened. And that's the way that works. It's deliberate and intentional. And it's explicit memory. In other words, it's memory tied to a context and not based on not based so much on being overwhelmed. And then finally, the demand for energy is very high, and it's very costly energy-wise to be conscious, to be present, to be fully aware, to be intentional, to be deliberate, requires us to use high levels of energy. Well, why is that a problem? Because 86 or so, depending on where you look for the research around this, roughly about 80%, 86% of all of our behavior is operating at the automatic, autopilot, non-conscious brain. About 14% is occurring in our conscious brain. So you can see by far that we are much more likely to run on automatic responses than we are intentional responses. This is a challenge for us because if we want a client to be able to thrive, they have to be able to operate in that 14% as much as they can, and to manage staying out of the 86% as much as they can. So what neural pathways are you operating on automatically? How many of your behaviors, your actions are just autopilot? And how many of your clients are just autopilot? Does that mean that all the behaviors you engage in with autopilot are good for you, healthy for you, health promoting for you? Are they good for your relationships? Are they good for your work ethic? Are they good for you, period? And the answer has to be, truthfully, most of them are not. They're not for your client either. Or if you're a teacher, the neural pathways that are operating in the children in your classroom, if they have built a lot of neurocircuitry above threshold, they're operating on that system. So how can you tell when a client, a child, a coworker, a spouse, a friend is dysregulated and not at the top of the ladder? These are the behaviors you see, and I'm going to go through this, and I want you to think, how many times have you been told that these are the problem? How many times have you been told that these are lack of self-control? These are proof of willful choices in behavior. And I am hoping that by the time we finish this section, you will have completely assassinated this belief. Because if you are not at the top of the ladder and you're pretty well dysregulated, these are the typical things you should experience. A general lack of organization, schedules, and routines. Mood swings and emotional-based decision-making. Lack of personal peace or life satisfaction. Feeling overwhelmed quite often. Feeling confused, a lack of clarity of purpose, a lack of clarity on action and reason. Low energy or frenetic energy. In other words, you're kind of shut down and no energy at all, or you're like hyper energetic. Self-doubt, you'll feel like an imposter, a pretender, you'll have a lot of questions of worthlessness. Fear and anxiety are driving behavior. Procrastination is a driving behavior. Difficulty focusing and staying focused, or having your kind of mind wander constantly, is a sign of not being at the top of the ladder. Chaotic thinking, low confidence. We all struggle with these to some extent, but the longer and more often we are above our threshold of tolerance, the more likely we are to build autopilot systems that are built around these features. And so when you start looking at this, isn't this what you're seeing in a lot of the people that you're working with? I don't care if it's a mental health client, a student in a classroom, a coworker in the next office, your spouse, your children, your neighborhood. These are reflective of people not operating in the top of the ladder. When you are at the top of the ladder, you have flow, it's easy to focus. You tend to be organized, and I'm not talking about compulsively, perfectionistically organized, but you're well organized. You focus without distraction, you have clear thinking, the ability to prioritize well, you have the ability to plan and follow through at this point. You experience stress without becoming overwhelmed. You can be emotionally present, feeling the breadth of emotion without having to react to it. You're optimistic even when experiencing difficulty. You're generally happy and you have greater confidence. So it's really clear. What we're trying to do is create an optimal environment for our client, or help them create an optimal environment for themselves. These are the things that are necessary to have an optimal environment. And way too often, most of our clients are in this state. And quite often, I find that a lot of therapists, teachers, parents, coworkers are in this state. So part of this, what I'm hoping it drives for you, is a greater compassion for people. Instead of being frustrated that your coworker is procrastinating, understand what it is. Somehow this environment is not safe. Somehow they're not at the top of the ladder. How can you help? Instead of focusing on the procrastination, focus on how can I create greater safety and stability in this environment? How can I help my friend in the next office move to the top of the ladder? If I'm working with children and I'm trying to correct behaviors, I'm not going to get those corrected if they aren't at the top of the ladder. And then here's what you hear. I hear this from parents quite often. I've had this conversation with them 50 times. When are they finally going to hear it? Well, they can't hear it because they're not at the top of the ladder. What are you doing to help them get there and stay there so they can learn from this experience? And what we end up doing is using more aggressive, more punitive means to try to get our point in their mind, and end up making them more stressed, which means they're going to fall back on more automatic behavior and be less likely to be intentional. So this is an important mechanism to understand. What does this mean about sustainable change? Let's be really practical. You consciously want to lose 25 pounds. You create a goal with action steps and you begin to work on it. How long is it before you give up and start cheating on the weight loss regime? Pretty quickly? So think about it. It takes an incredible amount of focus and cognitive energy to stay on track. I don't care if it's losing 25 pounds or being able to, go out and run 3 miles, or whatever you're wanting to do that's an intentional behavior is going to require a lot of cognitive energy. And you're going to have to do it long enough until you build a new pattern. And, a lot of people say, if you do it for 30 days, then you'll do it. No, that's not true at all. It has more to do with how your nervous system has been built. I find, for me personally, when I start a new behavior, I have to do it for close to a year before it just becomes kind of automatic. And a lot of people with trauma histories, that's what you're going to find is pretty consistent, is 30 days of doing something is not going to create that neural pathway. It's going to take a lot longer to do that. That isn't because they aren't committed to the change. It is simply the nature of the physiology at work. The dragons sees your goal as a threat. In other words, that automatic system sees your goal as a threat. Why? Because it's demanding all this energy. And so what is its job? its job is to slap you and keep you from doing that. Its job is to bring you back to the status quo. Let's get you back into the easy, low usage, automatic behavior. And it does whatever it can to do that. Now, the dragon has some pretty interesting strategies. So, you fail or self-sabotage. And then when you do, you feel shame or blame. You blame your character, you blame your willpower, and you basically train yourself to not move forward because, why? Because it requires too much energy. Now, that's not what you're doing. You're assassinating your own character and your own soul, but that's designed to keep you from using all this power. Your belief system that you will never be able to do anything like this is reinforced by which is the dragon strengthening the status quo. What does this tell us? That cognitive desires are not aligned with your automatic system. You haven't gotten the dragon's buy-in yet. And until you can get the dragon to buy into your change process, it's going to be clunky, uncomfortable, and at every turn, the moment you get distracted, you're going to go back to old behavior. Being at the top of the ladder is necessary to align our emotions, our beliefs, and build new neural pathways. And you have to be able to be intentional for long enough to practice these new neural pathways in order to support your sustainable change. So one of the things that we're doing with the approach that we're talking about and why we're looking at an asset-focused approach is, with an asset-focused approach, you're always going to go for self-regulation, building capacity, meeting primary emotional and social needs. You're going to strengthen personal resilience to stressors. You're going to strengthen interpersonal resources. You're going to develop a long-term view of positive expectation, which is a process. It's not something you just wake up with one morning. And you're going to be working at constantly increasing your client's choice and their voice around how they're amazing rather than how they're broken. So how often have you or your client been fatigued in your effort to achieve a goal? What does that tell you is you do not have your dragon aligned with your wishes. So without your dragon's agreement, you will make poor progress. I want to make sure that you understand that. I'm telling you, without that 86% of your system agreeing with your intentionality, you will likely fail. And that isn't a character issue. It isn't a lack of willpower. It is simply you're not being aware of what is really going on. So let me kind of illustrate what is happening. You're having experiences in the environment, and your nervous system makes a connection. That is normal connection. Let's see it again in slow motion. The nervous system is looking to make connections. It's very active. It's going to make most of those connections based on what we are perceiving cellularly about our environment and the meaning we're making of that. That little memory has all the aspects of this situation in it. So what I felt, what the sensory experience was, what the emotional experience was, what the thinking experience was. It has the physical sensations, the sensory experiences. I may have the auditory, what was the sounds going on at the time. All of that is built into that little memory. If I'm above threshold and above threshold and above threshold and above threshold, I'm building this kind of a nervous system above the threshold, which is what? These are all kind of reactive or mitigating neurocircuitry. So, and the more I repeat it, the more repetition that occurs, the stronger it becomes. And then what happens is that I am building an entire neural pathway around my automatic responses. And a neural pathway looks like what I'm going to show you right here. That's a neural pathway. It's not organized. It's all built on experience. It's not built on what people say to you necessarily. It's not based on formal instruction. It's based on the experiences that we're having in any environment, the meaning we're making out of that, and building neurocircuitry to deal with that. This is mostly a non-conscious process. To build new neural pathways, though, and to do it on purpose, you have to be able to stay at the top of the ladder. This is one of the reasons that in trauma work in particular, you need your client to be at the top of the ladder before any model of treatment is going to work very well for them. Now, we are in these neuroceptive responses to our environment, and for most of us, by the age of 3, we've developed some pretty decent templates. The first 4 that we know that are built are relational templates, emotional templates, cognitive templates, and physical templates, how do you use your body templates. And once a template is built, we operate on it autopilot-like or automatically without any kind of thought process. We're in the pattern of it. And as human beings, we are looking for confirmation of our patterns. We're not looking for disconfirmation. Regardless of what the pattern is, whether it's useful or not, we are more likely to look for how it's right than why it's not working very well for us. And this makes sense if your system is above threshold. You're doing very little self-reflection and self-evaluation. You're just operating on automatic. So you get in your car, you have a whole process for that, but you just do it automatically at this point. You head home, you pull into the driveway, and you don't remember the trip. As long as something didn't disturb your pattern, you ran on automatic. Now, if you were on your way home and a water main broke and you have to go, 2 miles out of your way to get home, you're going to be irritated. And that's what's that system saying. And let's take it back to our pattern. You have to be conscious now because the old pattern that we like and we rely on isn't working. And now we have to be intentional. And our body's going to respond to that negatively. The dragon begins to rear its ugly head, and you're angry and frustrated. You can't run on your pattern. And yet we forget that's true often when we're working with clients. And we expect them to discontinue their well-established patterns because we think it's good for them to do that. And we haven't got them at the top of the ladder so they can be conscious. And they are running on their well-established networks of neural pathways that were built, and they run on them automatically. If you want somebody to change those patterns, they have to do it through acts of focus, intentionality, and they have to be able to act deliberately. And that's not what a lot of our clients are walking in the door with. So the question is this a choice? Is it a choice for us to because the traditional mindset is if you have enough willpower and you have enough quality of character, you make a choice and that's it for you. But folks, that's just not it for most of us. Choice is only available if we're at the top of the ladder, if we're in Bruce Banner mode or in Einstein mode. If we're not at the top of the ladder, we don't really have much choice. We are in reactive modes. And that means we're going to be making emotional decisions. We're going to be disorganized. We're going to have all of these things kind of going on. Now, when I say being disorganized, it doesn't mean that you don't have lists with your lists to help you feel productive. But how much of your time is being absorbed and being, that you have to be that kind of organized, and aren't you constantly fighting that? So, I mean, this is just kind of normal human stuff. This is not pathology. It's not mental illness. It's not a psychiatric issue. Once a pattern is built, it becomes non-conscious, where it occurs without conscious decision making. Any of you that have been driving for a few years, when you first started learning to drive, you were just having trouble organizing everything. I learned to drive with a clutch, a 4-speed clutch. And, if you were on a hill and you put the brake on and put the clutch in to disengage the engine, sometimes the car rolled back a little bit. And, I bumped into a couple of people in the front end of their car because I didn't get the brake hit enough. Didn't do much damage. It just kind of rolled back. And if you're in a hilly area and you're trying to learn how to drive with a clutch, a shifter, you're going to, it's going to be tough. It's a lot of things to coordinate. But after a few months of doing that, it's kind of like automatic. And after a few years, you don't even think about it. You just get in, fire up your car, and drive off, and you're running on automatic because the pattern has moved from being something that was consciously done to being unconscious now. And what we need to do as we move forward is, if we can get somebody at the top of the ladder and they can do a behavior enough, what we can do is actually have this new behavior become non-conscious. Even when new patterns are built, earlier, more primitive patterns are still available. And the moment we get stressed in our body, or we become overwhelmed, or we move above the threshold, we're going to go back to the old familiar patterns, because it requires a great amount of attention and energy to focus on new patterns. Change is difficult because it requires on-purpose, intentional focus. So I've been belaboring this quite a bit because it's such an important point, and I want to make sure that you're able to grasp it. So let me show you a little video. This is Destin Sandler, who has a podcast, YouTube, called Smarter Every Day. And this is the link where you can find this in YouTube.
Hey, it's me, Destin. Welcome back to Smarter Every Day. You've heard people say it's just like riding a bike, meaning it's really easy and you can't forget how to do it, right? But I did something. that damaged my mind. It happened on the streets of Amsterdam, and I got really scared, honestly. I can't ride a bike like you can anymore. Before I show you the video of what happened, I need to tell you the backstory. Like many 6-year-olds with a MacGyver mullet, I learned how to ride a bike when I was really young. I had learned a life skill and I was really proud of it. Everything changed though when my friend Barney called me 25 years later. Where I work, the welders are geniuses and they like to play jokes on the engineers. He had a challenge for me. He had built a special bicycle and he wanted me to try to ride it. He had only changed one thing. When you turn the handlebar to the left, the wheel goes to the right. When you turn it to the right, the wheel goes to the left. I thought this would be easy, so I hopped on the bike ready to demonstrate how quickly I could conquer this.
And here he is, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Destin Sandler. First attempt riding the bicycle.
All right. So the faster I go, the better. Yeah.
I couldn't do it. You can see that I'm laughing, but I'm actually really frustrated. In this moment, I had a really deep revelation. My thinking was in a rut. This bike revealed a very deep truth to me. I had the knowledge of how to operate the bike, but I did not have the understanding. Therefore, knowledge is not understanding. Look, I know what you're probably thinking. Destin's probably just an uncoordinated engineer and can't do it. But that's not the case at all. The algorithm that's associated with riding a bike in your brain is just that complicated. Think about it. Downwards force on the pedals, leaning your whole body, pulling and pushing the handlebars, gyroscopic precession in the wheels, every single force is part of this algorithm. And if you change any one part, it affects the entire control system. I do not make definitive statements that often, but I'm telling you right now, you cannot ride this bicycle. You might think you can, but you can't. I know this because I'm often asked to speak at universities and conferences, and I take the bike with me. It's always the same. People think they're going to try some trick or they're just going to power through it. It doesn't work. Your brain cannot handle this. For instance, this guy, I offered him $200 just to ride this bike 10 feet across the stage. Everybody thought he could do it.
No, you didn't understand. You didn't understand. So, this way. Okay. All right, just a second. All right, so, whenever you're ready. Yeah. Wait. No, you have to keep your feet on. Dude, all right, here we go. Wait. Like, you gotta start rolling at least. And go. Oh, go! All right, back up. Okay, wait. Keep your feet on the pedal. Go. Go right on. Just keep your feet on the pedals. Handles on. Yeah, come on. No, you're good. All right, one more time. Okay.
Once you have a rigid way of thinking in your head, sometimes you cannot change that, even if you want to. So here's what I did. It was a personal challenge. I stayed out here in this driveway and I practiced about 5 minutes every day. My neighbors made fun of me. I had many wrecks, but after 8 months, this happened. One day I couldn't ride the bike and the next day I could. It was like I could feel some kind of pathway in my brain that was now unlocked. It was really weird though. It's like there's this trail in my brain, but if I wasn't paying close enough attention to it, my brain would easily lose that neural path and jump back onto the old road it was more familiar with. Any small distractions at all, like a cell phone ringing in my pocket, would instantly throw my brain back to the old control algorithm and I would wreck, but at least I could ride it. My son is the closest person to me genetically, and he's been riding a normal bike for 3 years. That's over half his life. I wanted to know how long it would take him to learn how to ride a backwards bike, so I told him if he learned how to ride a backwards bike, he could go with me to Australia and meet a real astronaut.
Are you gonna give up? No. Go ahead. This is how it starts. Look at this. This is such a big deal. Get up, you got it. Did you see his brain get it? So in how many weeks have we been doing this? 2 weeks? In 2 weeks, he did something that took me 8 months to do, which demonstrates that a child has more neuroplasticity, am I even saying that right, than an adult.
It's clear from this experiment that children have a much more plastic brain than adults. That's why the best time to learn a language is when you're a young child.
All right, today's bike log. I can ride smooth, I can ride fast. I'm thinking the experiment is over.
Okay, now I'm in Amsterdam, a city that has more bicycles than people. The question is, can I ride a normal bike now? I mean, I've spent all this time unlearning how to ride a bike. If I go back and try to ride a normal one, will my brain mess up? So I've tweeted a Smarter Everyday meetup, if you will, and I'm gonna see if somebody brings a bicycle and I'm gonna try to ride a normal bike. It's backwards, it's backwards.
This was one of the most frustrating moments of my life. I had ridden a normal bike since I was 6, but in this moment, I couldn't do it anymore. I had set out to prove that I could free my brain from a cognitive bias. But at this point, I'm pretty sure that all I proved is that I could only redesignate that bias.
So what you're not seeing is just a group of people here looking at me, looking at the strange American that can't ride a bike because they think I'm dumb. But I'm actually 2 levels deep into this because I've learned and unlearned. All right.
After 20 minutes of making a fool out of myself, suddenly my brain clicked back into the old algorithm. I can't explain it, but it happened in a very specific moment.
I got it. I'm back. Oh, it clicked. Hold on, it clicked. I got it. Okay, there it is. There was the moment. Okay, I can ride a bike.
I tried to explain this to the people around me, and they just didn't get it. They thought I was faking the previous 20 minutes, and I couldn't get anybody to believe me.
That looked like I faked that, didn't it?
Yeah.
Just a fake. You think I'm faking. You don't believe me.
That was so weird. You were like, la la la, and it's full.
You think I'm lying, don't
Yeah, I
you?
do.
I'm not lying.
I felt like the only person on the planet who had ever unlearned how to ride a bike, and I couldn't articulate it to anyone because everybody just knew that you can't forget how to ride a bike. So I learned 3 things from this experiment. I learned that welders are often smarter than engineers. I learned that knowledge does not equal understanding. And I learned that truth is truth, no matter what I think about it. So be very careful how you interpret things because you're looking at the world with a bias, whether you think you are or not. I'm Destin. You're getting smarter every day. Have a good one.
What I really like about that video with Destin, the backwards bicycle, is that the things that we've just talked about in the slides before are exactly what he experienced. It took him a long time to build a new neural pathway, and if he got distracted from it, he would wreck or fall off or not be able to do it. The level of intentionality required to build new neural pathways, which is the foundation of what we do, the way we act, the way we feel, the way we behave, the way we emote, to build ones that are the healthiest for us is going to take some time at the top of the ladder. Once we understand this much of the biology, we are now ready to talk about the dopamine cascades and their effect on our motivation. So we talked about earlier the difference between adapting behaviors and mitigating behaviors. And I'm going to just do a quick review of these. We talked about this earlier in our presentation. Adaption is taking assertive, aggressive, hostile action to resolve or control. And when we do that, it's rewarded with dopamine cascades, what we call micro-releases or micro-cascades. Mitigation is acting in some way to minimize risk or to reduce our experience of something or a sensation, anything that's associated with being unpleasant or dangerous. And when we mitigate, this is rewarded by dopamine cascades or those micro-releases. So depending on what your habit of interacting, some people are going to be more adaption-oriented. They're going to be more of the aggressive, the controlling, they're going to take action to resolve. And you're going to have people that actually withdraw, shut down, and try to turn off those sensations. And regardless of which one you do, your body's rewarding you for it. And that becomes an important piece because in the world of mental health, and what we basically said is mitigation is bad and you should never do it. And we have all sorts of negativity. We really only value in Western culture the assertive, the take control, and that's half of our strategies of getting through things. And if somebody has grown up with a history of trauma, toxic stress, or repetitive adversity, there's a good chance that their primary adaptive process is mitigation, and that their body and their nervous system has been built to reward mitigation. So why am I kind of belaboring this point is you're trying to create change in the life of your client or help them create change in the life of their client or your student or your child or your coworker or your neighbor, whoever you're trying to do this with. And almost every program assumes that everybody's in that assertive, take action and move forward kind of mentality. But you're going to run into a lot of false starts with that if you're thinking that and you believe that, and that's the way the way you counsel or encourage or coach is built. That only is going to work on the folks that are active adapters like that. It's not going to work for the people that mitigate. And the more history they have of toxic stress, adversity, and trauma, the more likely you're going to run into is a strong theme of mitigation. That is not wrong, it's not bad, it's not better or worse than the other. It just is a reality. Well, why are we even pointing this out at this point is because if all of your system is designed in a way that is assuming that something out here in the future is going to be wonderful and you want to work towards that, and you're dealing with somebody who's their nervous system has been built around mitigation, you can talk this all day long, and they aren't going to be able to perceive it they may academically understand it, but they're not going to be able to live into it because it's not the way their nervous system has been built to be rewarded. And instead, you have to function from the point of view, how do we help them mitigate in the direction that they want to go? So based on our history of experiences, we have built procedural memory on how to operate in the world, and those pathways have been reinforced by dopamine cascades, which means that it's our way of operating. We feel right, we feel appropriate, it feels instinctual to behave this way. And the procedural memory or neural pathways that we've built are incredibly difficult to change unless you or your client can stay at the top of the ladder. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about related concepts to what we've covered so far, and I'm just going to kind of bullet point them out. What is your comfort zone really? Your comfort zone is where your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors have become habituated. In other words, you have procedural memory. These are low energy demanding activities. Our comfort zone is our low energy demand, well-built neurocircuitry. Your comfort zone is your autopilot system. And it doesn't, remember again, it doesn't demand much energy. It utilizes much less cognitive energy than to being intentional or being fully present. It's really interesting in the world of mental health, we talk about being fully present. We talk about the client being present, we talk about the therapist being present, but how many sessions do you get through actually staying in a fully present state? If you were able to stay at the top of the ladder for the whole session and really focus on your client, I bet you would be exhausted after 1 or 2 sessions. So it's something that you would have to really build up to. It's not something you can just turn on one day and be able to be successful at it. But this idea of a comfort zone, a lot of times people mistake and think, well, comfort zone is really about where I feel comfortable, where I'm having kind of a pleasure, and they don't understand how people can have comfort zones that are distressing to themselves or other people. And the reality is that it's kind of a mistaken understanding of what a comfort zone really is. Again, the comfort zone is the well-established neurocircuitry that requires less energy and runs more on a habituated or a procedural structure, and you just engage in those behaviors automatically. That's a comfort zone. And the idea of actually being comfortable in a comfort zone is kind of a mistaken idea. A comfort zone is really about energy demand. It's the low energy demand system. So we are all capable of both adaptation and mitigation. We've talked about that before. We each have a preferred procedural memory or neural pathway that we tend to use dominantly. In other words, in my case, I tend to be a mitigator first, and I really have to be intentional. I really have to be deliberate in order to take intentional action or be assertive, and that's based on my learning history. Neither is right or wrong. Let me say that again. Neither is right or wrong. They're both part of the human makeup, and we've got to stop seeing half of the human strategies for dealing with situations as being bad because it doesn't fit into the culturally accepted view that we should be strong and we should be assertive and we should be taking action and we should be aggressive and we should be moving forward, because that's just not what you're going to find in a lot of your trauma clients. In fact, you're not going to find it very common, and it's certainly not going to be in a proportional response to people that aren't at the top of the ladder. To further simplify, again, neither is wrong. The reactive adaptation process can be thought of as a moving toward or against. And the reactive mitigating process can be thought of as moving away or avoiding. Neither moving towards or against or moving away or avoiding is wrong. How often have you been frustrated with the client because the way you have designed things, you're wanting them to move forward, to move towards something, to move over here, achieve this. Don't you want this? Don't you want this wonderful relationship? Don't you want this wonderful marriage? Don't you want these wonderful kids? And we keep talking in terms of moving in a direction towards something. And almost everything in treatment is kind of based on that idea. And what I'm going to suggest is that you may have inadvertently shamed them because they could not see a future without a problem, or because they aren't, by their neurocircuitry, designed to be movement towards or against. They are designed by their nervous system and their learning history and the way their body has built that nervous system, that they are avoidant or moving away folks. And how often have you looked at the struggle the client is having as evidence that there's something wrong with them? They must have a hole in their head, or they must have some flaw of character because they aren't able to stay assertive and move towards that goal. And that is very common. You don't just see it in mental health, you see it in education. You see it in organizations, in businesses, in workplaces, and you see it in families. This idea that they must march forward to some goal and that they have to want something. Well, if you have people that have a history of trauma, toxic stress, and adversity, they have learned to want things puts them at risk. So instead of wanting something, wanting a new job, wanting a rich lifestyle, wanting, the best new car, wanting the big house, what they want is to avoid discomfort, want to avoid distress, want to avoid arousal, want to avoid conflict. And we've got to stop seeing that as an evil state or a wrong state or mental illness. Instead, realize how that was built and work with it. In all likelihood, if you're working with people that have had histories of trauma, toxic stress, and adversity, they have not been stabilized long enough, often enough, to build neurocircuitry to move towards. And if they have, a lot of it is incredibly aggressive and hostile. And so that idea that we kind of idealized of the person pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and setting a goal and without accepting any kind of deviation, marching towards that goal is BS from a neurobiological point of view. We want to always look to those cases of people that seem to have been able to do that, and we really idealize those, but the reality is most of the folks that we work with are not going to be competent at doing that. Because of their learning history, they're going to be movement away and avoidant kinds of approaches to things. So things that are exciting and fun and things that are perceived as threatening are both easily wired into the nervous system. But neither of those is something that's really done in a state of being fully focused. However, the things that make us afraid and fearful will be encoded more quickly and completely. In other words, I can have fun, but I'm going to remember danger more quickly. If you don't believe that's true, think in your own life. How many of your birthdays can you remember with any detail, even though you remember that you had parties? If you had a party at your 5th birthday, do you remember the details of it? In all likelihood, you do not, or you don't remember very many of them, or you've kind of tailored them a little bit. But if you get bullied in school, man, you can remember that, because anything that makes us afraid or fearful or anxious, we are much more likely to build into the nervous system, because that's part of our survival. And the that has an increased relevance because it made us feel unsafe. How many of your clients are seeking treatment to gain relief from something? They're seeking to avoid feeling, experiencing, or thinking in a certain painful way or distressing ways. And now that you can kind of understand mitigation a little bit, how future or forward focused are how movement forward are most of your clients? Aren't most of them moving away kind of folks? Because what I found fairly consistent with people with trauma histories is that they are much more comfortable mitigating than trying to move towards or against something. And that's fine. You just have to figure out, how do I motivate someone to take action to avoid or to move away from into the right direction. So this is not a crazy new concept. This is just fundamental understanding of how neurosystems are built. And we've gone through that. But let me give you a day-to-day kind of practical application of this. If you watch advertisements, and let's pick something silly, dentistry advertisements, they illustrate this really well. They try to approach people that operate both ways. So the movement toward or forward-oriented folks, the assertive, take control kind of folks, how do we advertise to those folks? We say, floss, brush your teeth and floss every day, and you will be loved, admired. Your smile will electrify a room, and you will have lots of good connections with people. That's forward-oriented. If I go the other way and I'm trying to help people avoid in the direction they need to go, I'm going to talk about, if you don't floss and brush your teeth every day, they're going to rot and fall out. Your breath is going to be bad. Nobody will love you or want to be with you. The goal is the same. Get them to brush and floss. But we have, in advertisers, appeal to both. And that's just kind of because they understand this is not a choice. It is a biology built on prior learning. And if you understand that, you tend to be a forward, assertive kind of person, you're going to find yourself having impatience for the people that mitigate, because they should do it like you do, because of course how you do it is the gospel truth and absolute right, and people that don't do it like you must be wrong. What that really is an incredible insensitivity to the neurodiversity of your client. And we do it over and over and over again in every organization that I have seen. There's an implicit bias that the only value is future forward thinking, and that movement towards or against is the only thing that's really valued. And that's very unfortunate, because we are leaving a lot of people behind, because that's not the way their nervous system has been built. So let's talk about motivation then. How do you motivate your trauma client? Or anybody that has a history of trauma, toxic stress, or adversity. Remember that your comfort zones are your familiar patterns that are running on autopilot. What happens when you set a goal that requires intentionality, deliberateness, or repeated action is you activate your dragon system. Your paralimbic system is alerted. Your Hulk or dragon system is kicked in. Your system is going to activate automatic strategies to bring you back to low energy use, restore the status quo, stop you from using your valuable cognitive energy. And what are your native stop growing and using all your energy strategies? What are those strategies that are familiar to you? So let's look at some of those. Hey, you, stop growing. The cognitive energy saving strategies. And I'm hoping that's kind of fun for you. it's like you get this message from your dragon parts of your system. Stop growing. You're using too much darn energy. So what do is that system that's trying to keep you from using energy activates your inner critic with all the messaging that goes with your inner critic. And that's going to be unique to everybody's learning experience. They're going to bring forward into your mind all your painful, hurtful, fearful prior learning so that you can say, if you see the dangers here, you don't want to keep doing this because these are going to be the problems you're going to run into. They're awful and terrible. Please stop using energy. You're going to get a lot of fear-provoking imagery. Imagery that normally isn't available. All of a sudden, every awful possibility comes flooding into your mind. Your body tension, makes you notice more body tension, making you uncomfortable and kind of distressing yourself. These are strategies that your own body is bringing to bear because you are trying to use all that cognitive energy. So let's go back and look at how do you change your focus. If you are a forward-focused person and you're used to moving against or towards something, it's going to be very difficult for you to come back and look at this differently, but you can do it. So I used the toothbrush one already as an example, but think about what we tell students. If you study hard and you get a good grade, you'll go to college next year, or you will be ranked number 12 in your class of 400. I mean, we use that kind of stuff to motivate people. However, if they're avoidant based, how would you structure that same conversation? If you pass this class or this test, you can avoid that horrible summer school. And people say, well, that's not very positive. That's because your bias is towards moving toward or against. And the client, the student, your coworker may not be motivated that way. Just because they don't motivate like you motivate does not make them wrong or broken. And if you feel that way towards people you're working with, it shows an incredible lack of tolerance for their neurodiversity, which is, we talk a lot about diversity in all of its flavors, and yet the thing that is least acceptable in our society is neurodiversity. People that think and feel differently than we do or operate differently than we do, we have no patience for those people. If you work really hard on this, you can have this amazingly close relationship with your spouse. That's a forward or towards. If you work really hard at this, your spouse won't be angry with you all the time. That's a movement away. You're moving away from the anger and upset of your spouse. That is, they're still moving in the right direction. It is the way we couch it. So if you are going to have clients that are traumatized or have had histories of trauma, you need to be effective and efficient at structuring goals from both perspectives. And probably need to be able to do more of the avoidance-based or away-focused than the movement towards, even though the movement away isn't how any program is really built. Everything is built, all models are built around this idea of aggressive, assertive action towards something that's wanted. However, people with these trauma histories of a toxic stress and a repetitive adversity, often what they want is to avoid experiencing something that's negative. And for them, it's a huge leap to move forward. It feels almost impossible and unmanageable for them. And yet we keep wanting them to do that. Even the way we structure intakes in most of the mental health services sets people up to fail. What do we expect for them to do the very first time they come in? And we don't do it because it's good for the client. We do it because companies can't bill until it's done. So, of course, we need to get it done right quick. And that is, you're dealing with an unregulated person and you're wanting them to talk about what they want out of therapy. And the truth is usually, I don't want to feel bad. Most of your clients are going to give you movement away answers. And then what we do is we try to operationalize that, which is incredibly disrespectful. That'd be like me having a conversation with you and you would say, well, you know, how do you like to spend time? And I tell you, I like to spend time in a quiet place in painting. And not that I really paint, because I don't really like painting at all, but I mean, saying that is I like to spend my time alone painting, and that's how I refresh. If you're a forward towards person, you're going to be very frustrated, because what's the goal of painting? Are you going to make any money on it? You know, what's the purpose you're doing it? I am doing it because I avoid feeling distressed while I'm doing it, and that's rewarding. I'm getting dopamine releases. But the real challenge for us is to be truly compassionate with people. We need to understand that people operate from both perspectives, and people with histories of trauma, toxic stress, and adversity are going to be on the weighted side of mitigating or movement away and again, movement away and avoiding. I hope that makes sense. So clients that have complex trauma are likely to present with an avoid-away procedural memory. That's their way of approaching things in life. And if you're going to be maximally effective in motivating them, you're going to have to work with the way their nervous system works, which means achievement-oriented goals are probably not going to be the thing that motivates them. You must be able to help your client move away and avoid into the future they want. Now, the research around motivation, particularly as it relates to dopamine cascades, is kind of interesting. It suggests that we get more reinforcement, if you will, more dopamine cascades from taking small steps towards something than actually achieving it. And rather than go through all the science of this, let me give you an easy example. Kids at Christmas time. You know, gifts have been out for 2 or 3 days, and they're walking by and they're so excited because they have an expectation. And that expectation, every time they think about what it might be, they get a nice little shot of dopamine. And that gets them excited, and they're so excited and so happy. But what happens when they open presents, either on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day or whenever their family does that? How often do you see them tear those packages open, see what it is, and throw it aside, and grab the next package? Because the achieving isn't where the dopamine cascade comes from. It is the expectations towards what's possible is where the dopamine cascades come from. So if you understand this, what we see a lot of folks do is they make these huge, big goals out here. We're going to do this. But you know better than that. You know that that's probably not going to be met most of the time. Even you yourself probably don't meet these consistently. Instead, we have to help people have little micro releases of dopamine along the way. And that is small little chunks, small little doses, small little gains that we can kind of reinforce along the way. Well, that doesn't fit with the mentality of Western culture, which is set your goals high. If you don't make your goal in the heavens, you're going to drag your feet on the trees. I mean, this is kind of crazy stuff that we talk about all the time. We talk about, reaching for the stars. That's great if I am a movement towards person. But a lot of your trauma clients are not going to be movement toward people. And when they do move toward people, it's more of the move against them. So they're aggressive and hostile and not balanced and assertive in moving towards something. You know, they have almost a manic drive to achieve that thing. And that's great for those people. I mean, it's not often very healthy for them, but it's great for them because that's the way their system works. And we keep trying to take people that are mitigators and try to make them into adapters. And that's really kind of a problem. And it shows a lack of understanding and a lack of sensitivity on our part when we find ourselves doing that. To help the client, you must be able to help them create dopamine cascades based on the way their system works, not yours, not what's socially reinforced societally, not what is, accepted. And a lot of the self-help literature, business, literature, a lot of the sales literature out there is all designed for people to be the movement toward or against folks. And that's great, but we're really underserving a large portion of the population because they aren't that way. Where have I seen this really play out is in First Nation groups, which tend to be more, they tend to just naturally be more mitigating. And Western culture, we keep wanting them to adopt the practices that we think are correct, and they don't prosper in those, and then we feel that there's something wrong with them. And the real problem isn't with them, it's with us trying to help them. We're trying to help them become like us rather than trying to help them develop what's good and what's useful for them. Because we do not value mitigating in our society. We only value and we cherish the aggressive, the hostile, the assertive, the person that's moving towards something. We admire those folks and we kind of look askance at the people that mitigate. You cannot have that attitude and work with trauma survivors. You cannot have that attitude and work with people that have had histories of toxic stress and repetitive, intense adversity in their life, because you are trying to get them to move into a system that isn't their natural system, and you will fail. And of course, because the therapy-minded person's ego is fairly weak most of the time, what do? Is we blame those failures on the client rather than what we are doing. And that's unfortunate. And again, it shows a tremendous lack of understanding and compassion for neurodiversity. So understand the difference and stop forcing your preference on your client. Movement towards is wanting to obtain something, usually object, status, power, and or control, which is what is societally reinforced and has been for hundreds of years. Movement away and avoid is wanting to reduce risk, hold back for safety, not be noticed or embarrassed, not to experience the negative, whatever it is for them that's negative. Why is that any less valuable to us than the first? And how often are you trying to force your client into operating in the first, the movement towards, rather than the movement away, avoid? So in a sense, if you keep trying to move them into that, what is societally kind of seen as the right way of doing things, what you're going to do is underserve your client. You're going to inadvertently shame them. You're going to inadvertently blame them, and you are adding additional layering of distress to these people. This is not something you can just look at lightly. This should fundamentally change how you see people and be less judgmental and critical of people that operate differently because of their way their nervous system has been built. This concludes the section on how trauma gets created.